3 hours before our family trip, my mother-in-law suddenly asked if I was really coming. She reminded me that I'm just the daughter-in-law and suggested I should stay home. I was really excited about this trip abroad and had planned everything, hoping it would help me connect with my in-laws. But instead of bringing us closer, things got worse. They didn't want me to go, and my mother-in-law seemed happy about it. Even my husband didn't say anything to support me. I felt hurt and frustrated. If they treated me this way, I decided I didn't care anymore. They would regret leaving me behind, right? But I ended up doing something unexpected as I watched them leave. Let me introduce myself. I'm Mess, 28 years old, and I'm studying design at an advertising agency. I married Rick almost a year ago. We met 3 years ago while working on an ad project. At first, we talked about work, but soon we found out that we both love to travel. Rick likes to travel within the country, while I enjoy going abroad. We connected over our dream trips and shared photos of places we wanted to visit. Our relationship grew deeper, and after 2 years of dating, Rick proposed. Although we haven't had our honeymoon yet, Rick often says he wants our first trip abroad to be our honeymoon. One time, I asked him if he had ever been abroad. He replied, "No, I always worry about not being able to communicate well." I reassured him, saying, "Don't worry, with smartphones and basic English, we can manage." I also told him, I'm not completely fluent in English either, but I really want to travel abroad. Seeing the beautiful landscapes that I've only seen on TV or in books is incredibly exciting. He agreed, saying, "Yeah, you're right. Japan has many charming places and attractions, but I'm drawn to traveling overseas. Every time I travel abroad, I'm amazed by how big everything is. Experiencing those stunning views up close, which you can't fully understand just by staying in Japan, is the real excitement of international travel. Until now, I mostly traveled with friends or alone. Now, I can go on trips abroad with my wonderful husband, and it's joyful to share those experiences together." However, I didn't realize there was a side to my kind husband that I hadn't seen before. I noticed something about 2 months after we got married. We decided to rent an apartment halfway between our workplaces. Even though Rick's company wasn't doing well and his salary wasn't high, he still had some income. But just 2 months into our marriage, he surprised me with a request. He said, "Hey Sally, about the rent, could you cover mine for a while?" I was confused and asked why. He explained that his salary had been cut, and when he asked his parents for help, they told him to ask his wife. I was surprised and asked if his pay was really that low. He nodded quietly. He had always been cheerful, but seeing him like this made me hesitant to ask more questions. I never expected this just 2 months into our marriage, and it left me feeling disheartened. I should have checked our salaries before we got married. I didn't want him to take on extra work with his already long hours, so I said, "Okay," and decided to cover the rent completely starting that month. But that wasn't the only problem. My in-laws began visiting our new home often. Rick's family includes his father, mother, and sister, Amy. Since I agreed to cover Rick's share of the rent, my in-laws started coming over more frequently. They would show up without warning, have dinner, and sometimes stay overnight. It's not that I dislike them, but I felt uncomfortable, especially around my mother-in-law. She seemed to hold a grudge against me. Whenever she visited, she would make snide comments. For example, she'd say, "Hey Sally, just because you're busy doesn't mean you can neglect your chores." I would respond, "I'm doing the best I can with the chores." Then she'd say, "I heard from Rick that sometimes you come home later than him." As a wife, prioritizing work over household chores is unacceptable. I tried to explain, that's only when there's a deadline. Usually, I leave on time and take care of things at home. I always found myself getting defensive. My mother-in-law would say, "I bet work is more important to you than Rick." I would reply, "That's not true." I turned to my husband, hoping for support, but he just chuckled awkwardly and said, "Don't fight, okay?" It frustrated me that my mother-in-law annoyed me, but I was also angry at Rick for not standing up for me. Even when my father-in-law and sister-in-law made snide comments, he just smiled and watched. He always went along with their remarks, which hurt me more than dealing with the comments themselves. One day, when I got home from work, I found Rick looking at a travel guidebook for Hawaii. I asked, "What's that for?" I was curious about his sudden interest in travel. He lit up with excitement and said, "Hey Sally, How about going on a trip to Hawaii together? You've been there before, right? I replied. Yeah, I've been there 3 times. He continued. My family also wants to go, so your mom is coming too. I felt nothing but anxiety about his proposal. I really wanted to go on a trip abroad just with Rick, but with my in-laws involved, there were too many complications. Plus, I couldn't imagine my mother-in-law wanting to go on a trip with me, given how she felt about me. I tried to hint at my concerns, saying, I'd like to go to Hawaii, but I'm worried that your family won't enjoy themselves if I come along. He responded, that's not true. Besides, this trip was suggested by Mom. Just then, I heard someone knocking on the door. Hello? I called out. We'll be right out. I hurried to the front door. When I opened it, there stood my mother-in-law. Hello, Sally, are you going out today? She asked. I replied, we're actually heading out on a trip right now. I'm really excited for Hawaii. It's been a while. She looked confused and said, what are you talking about? We're the ones going on the trip. I was momentarily taken aback by her statement. Just then, Rick rushed over from inside the house, apologizing for being late. Seeing him, my mother-in-law smiled broadly and said, Rick, you're so late. I've been waiting outside. He replied, sorry, Mom, my hair wasn't cooperating. She urged him, you could have fixed that later. Come on, let's go. Dad and Amy are waiting. Hurry up. Then she added, Mom, that bag looks heavy. Let me carry it for you. My husband offered, thank you, you're always so kind. Rick, my mother-in-law praised him. He blushed happily at her words, but I felt a bit uneasy for a moment. Since it was the start of the trip, I didn't want to feel irritated right away. I grabbed my carry-on and began putting on my shoes. Then my mother-in-law looked puzzled and said slowly, wait a minute, Sally, what are you doing? I replied, I'm putting on my shoes too. We're going on a trip together. She responded coldly, enjoy your trip then. I was confused and said, what do you mean? We're all going to Hawaii together, right? My mother-in-law chuckled mockingly and said, seriously, you weren't actually planning to come along, were you? I insisted. Why would I not come on a family trip? She replied, this is supposed to be a family trip. You know, you're just a daughter-in-law, so obviously, you're staying home and holding down the fort. Just as I was about to walk out the door, her unexpected remark hit me hard, sending a wave of anguish through my chest and making me feel dizzy. I asked desperately, Rick, what does she mean? But he didn't respond. Instead, he headed toward the car with my mother-in-law, leaving me feeling like I might collapse. In that moment, my feelings toward Rick and my in-laws quickly cooled. What did I expect? Maybe it was foolish to hope my mother-in-law would ever support me, but I never imagined Rick would betray me like this. It became clear he had no intention of standing by me from the start. Everything felt absurd. I decided I didn't care anymore. I did love my husband, but I realized I was in love with an idealized version of him, not the real person. A spineless puppet who couldn't stand up to his family and just followed his mother's wishes. What had I ever seen in him? If only I had noticed this sooner, things might have turned out differently. But dwelling on regrets wouldn't change anything. I resolved to take action. Their trip was planned for a week, starting today. With that in mind, I packed my belongings into cardboard boxes and called my father to bring a car for me. While I waited for my father, my phone rang. It was my mother-in-law calling. I knew why she was calling but deliberately ignored it. She must have been furious since she had been calling me non-stop lately. But I stood firm in my decision. Then my husband called. He probably had a lot to say. I took a deep breath and answered, hello? Sally, you picked up, he said, sounding flustered and slightly trembling. I could imagine how panicked he must be, and I couldn't help but laugh. What's wrong? I asked. He replied, your mom kept calling me non-stop too. It's a disaster. We arrived in Hawaii fine, but I don't know where to go from here. I really want to check into the accommodation, but I don't know where it is or how to get there. What should I do? What do you mean you're asking me now? I replied, frustrated. You left without knowing anything, and now you're asking me? Isn't this your responsibility? He said, but you made the reservation, right? I thought someone in the family would have the travel plans. I chuckled bitterly, realizing how typical my spontaneous in-laws were. He raised his voice. Just tell me the travel schedule already. I could see how irresponsible my husband was. I muttered to myself in frustration. This guy is just his mother's son through and through. I firmly demanded to know the travel schedule from him. Are you kidding me? I'm feeling seriously uncomfortable because of you guys. Why do you think only you should have fun? He protested. There's no way I'm telling you. Figure it out yourselves. I retorted sharply. That's too heartless. I'll buy souvenirs. He tried to reason with me, but I replied, souvenirs? I don't need them. Don't make a fool of me. I trusted you and put up with your family, but I've had enough. How could you? I couldn't hold back my disappointment. This incident made me realize that he was just as disappointing as his mother. I felt used, only there to make travel plans, and left out of the much-anticipated trip to Hawaii. I couldn't forgive his family for this betrayal. I thought, let them struggle in that unfamiliar place on their own. Wait, hey Sally, my husband called out, but his attempts to reach me fell on deaf ears as I firmly ended the call. After waiting for my father, I headed straight to my parents' house. Meanwhile, it turned out that my husband and his family were having a rough time in Hawaii without me. Despite arriving, they panicked because they didn't know where their original booking was. They ended up staying at a random luxury resort, paying $5,000 per night for 4 people and maxing out their credit cards, which were eventually declined. They ended up spending the last 3 days camping in Hawaii. With my husband's modest salary, there was no way he could pay off the maxed-out credit cards. Ultimately, I decided to file for a divorce, citing his financial irresponsibility. While I awaited my husband's agreement, I was determined not to give up. I had already consulted a lawyer, so the divorce process was underway. This incident caused a rift in my husband's family. He blamed his mother, and she blamed him, leading to estrangement. As for me, I would stay with my parents until I found a new place. Initially worried, my parents now admired my resilience. I won't deny that I'm hurting, but dwelling on such a toxic family is pointless. This experience has taught me to better judge people in the future, and that's my focus moving forward.
After the death of his beloved wife Ella, Wilmer Castro, the head of a food company, didn't believe he could fall in love again and find happiness. But apparently, it is true when people say that grief lives for 3 years. And besides, Anna, Wilmer's mother, often encouraged her son, saying, "Dear, your son needs a mother, and you should keep living. I hope that one day you will find a good woman who will become a good wife for you and a good mother for our little Tio. You just need to look around." And then one day, the young widower met Ingrid. And after a week, he realized that she was the woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. Ingrid quickly bonded with his 6-year-old son Tio, which was a strong argument in favor of their relationship. A couple of months later, Wilmer proposed to his beloved, and they had a beautiful wedding. Anna was delighted. "Now I'm not afraid to die," said the elderly mother. "You and Tio are in good hands." "What are you talking about, Mum?" snorted the son. "Stop talking nonsense. Ingrid and I haven't given you a granddaughter yet, and you'll certainly dance at Tio's wedding." After their honeymoon in the Seychelles, the newlyweds started their family life, which, according to Wilmer, was beautiful. Unfortunately, after a while, Wilmer faced a serious problem. Tio started getting sick too often, and his father couldn't understand what was wrong. Ingrid loved the boy very much and created a careful environment for him, but it didn't help. One illness was followed by another, a runny nose, a sore throat, or even bronchitis. "Why don't we send him to a health camp?" Ingrid suggested. "But Tio has never been away from home for so long," Wilmer thoughtfully replied. "Well, you know, there's a first time for everything," his wife said. "Yes, but not at 6 years old," the man objected. "It seems a little early for him to be far away from his family alone." "I understand your concern, but I disagree. It will be good for Tio anyway. He'll become more independent, and most importantly, he'll get some fresh air and a change of environment and climate. Have you ever considered that life in the city may not be suited for him?" "No, I hadn't thought about that," Wilmer said, shaking his head. "Honey, I'm totally confused. I don't understand anything anymore. Everything was fine with him before, but now he's constantly sick. Wilmer, I try my best to prevent him from viruses, but all in vain I can," Ingrid said, sobbing and wiping tears from her eyes. "I'm watching Teo's diet and regularly airing his room. I don't want to keep him far away from us, because I love him, but I can't see his suffering any more. My heart aches for the poor boy." "Wouldn't it make sense to air his room less often? I think it's too chilly in there." "That's not a problem," replied the young wife. "It's worse for him when it's very hot, and fresh air reduces the germs. But you know I'm not a doctor, and in the camp Tio will be under the care of specialists." "Well, maybe you're right," Wilma said thoughtfully. "Perhaps a health camp is not such a bad idea." "Okay, I'll think about it. Thank you, my dear, for all you do for my son." And the loving father started exploring various options for children's recreation centres. Soon he found something suitable for Tio, and he promptly contacted the camp administration. "We have an individualised approach for each child," said a woman with a pleasant, well-pitched voice. "The minimum length of stay is 2 months." 2 months? Wilma repeated it with a slumped voice. Even though Wilma didn't fully understand the necessity of this trip, he wasn't ready to be apart from his son even for a whole month. "Yes, 2 months," the administrator confirmed. "But don't worry, you can visit your child on any day that is convenient for you." "Well, that's not so bad," Wilma replied. "And how do I sign up?" The administrator explained all the necessary details, and that was it. All that was left was to mentally prepare Tio for the trip. After all, the kid was going to be away from home for 2 months. But to Wilma's surprise, Tio's eyes lit up. "And will I play there with other kids?" the boy asked excitedly, and his father sighed. Yes, he understood pretty well that Tio lacked communication with his peers. He used to go to school, but as soon as a series of colds began, Wilma took his son out. So Ingrid was right. A kids' health camp was a great idea, no matter how you looked at it. However, a week before the departure, the boy complained of a severe headache. Putting his hand on his son's forehead, Wilma shrieked. Tio's forehead was as hot as a stove. The thermometer showed a temperature of almost 40. "Oh, God, this is the last thing we need," the father muttered in despair and sank into a chair. "What's wrong?" Ingrid asked as she entered, hearing her husband's last words. "Well, Tio is sick again," Wilma said, "and it seems quite serious." The young woman stared intently at her stepson and furrowed her brow. Tio's face turned red, and sweat started to appear on his forehead. "It looks like we'll have to postpone the trip," Wilma said. "And now we are going to the doctor." "Are you sure? We still have a week before we leave. Maybe he'll get better," Ingrid said. However, the next day, Tio showed no signs of improvement, and the doctor said that the trip was no longer an option. "And I would strongly recommend you to get a qualified nurse." "I see, thank you." "Why do we need a nurse?" Ingrid exclaimed as the doctor left. "Why do we need a stranger in the house? Do you know anything about medicine?" Wilma interrupted her. When it came to his son, Wilma was firm in his principles. "Well, no, but—" "Then this conversation is over," he said. "Tonight I will go to the agency's website and find a nurse." Realizing that her husband's decision to hire a nurse for his son was final and could not be challenged, Ingrid did not argue and nodded. "Well, that's fine," Wilma concluded. "Now I need to go to the office. Take care of Tio. If there's an emergency, call me." After completing some urgent tasks at work, Wilma hurried home. He trusted Ingrid as much as he trusted himself, but he felt calmer if Tio was by his side. As he drove over the bridge, he noticed a very young, poorly dressed girl. She seemed lost in thought, and then she swung her leg over the railing with the clear intention of jumping. Wilma slammed on the brakes and quickly got out of the car. "What do you think you're doing?" he shouted, pulling the stranger away from the railing. "Are you exhausted from living?" "Yes, tired," sobbed the girl. "This isn't life, but just suffering." "Come on, let's go to the car," Wilma commanded. After a little hesitation, the girl obeyed. "What's your name?" Wilma tried to ask her kindly. "Corey," replied the girl timidly. "Corey, tell me, why does such a young, beautiful girl think that life is suffering?" "I'm pregnant," Corey whispered and silently sobbed. "Wow, congratulations." The businessman shook his head reproachfully. "So you've decided not only to ruin yourself, but also your innocent child?" "My fiancé left me," the girl kept sobbing. "I trusted him, and he did such a cruel thing to me." "I see," Wilma nodded. "But that's still no reason to take your life and the life of your child." "It's easy for you to say, yes," she sighed. "But I have no one to turn to, and I have nowhere to live." "What about your parents?" As it turned out, Corey's father left the family when she was 2 years old. Her mother raised her alone, and when Corey was 14, her mother met Bob. Bob moved into their house in the village and took care of all the repairs that needed to be done. He seemed to be a hard worker in general, and both the mother and daughter were grateful for his help around the house. The idyllic situation lasted for exactly 3 months, and then Bob started to have bouts of drunkenness that would last for months. "Mum, why don't you kick him out?" Corey asked. "Why do you need him?" "You wouldn't understand," the mother sighed. "Even though he's bad, he's mine." And then Mum got sick. The 4th stage left no chance of recovery. The woman burned out like a candle in a matter of months. Bob kept living with his stepdaughter. "I'm registered here, so I'm not going anywhere," declared the stepfather. Corey was not glad to live with Bob, who was basically a stranger to her. But she couldn't help it, because Bob really was registered with them. After a while she met Steve. The young couple rented an apartment and began living together. However, the news of Corey's pregnancy did not make her boyfriend happy at all, and the poor girl moved out of the rented apartment. But when she returned to her mother's house, it turned out that the house had burned down. Bob said it happened because of old wiring, but Corey was sure because of his habit of smoking in bed. "I was desperate because I had nowhere to go and no one to ask for help." "There's always a way out," Wilma spoke slowly. "No, I'm not going to have an abortion," Corey said, shaking her head. "My mother told me never to do this because of my Rh-negative blood type. Otherwise, I will never have a baby anymore." "I see," Wilma sighed. He was puzzled. Unlike many businessmen, Wilma Castro had not lost his ability to feel compassion for the people around him, and therefore he wanted very much to help the stranger. But how could he help her? "And what can you do?" Wilma asked. "What do you mean?" frowned Corey. "You think if you have money you can offer—" The girl did not finish her line of thought and looked indignantly at Wilma. The man looked at her perplexed, and when he finally realized what she meant, he laughed. Wait, Corey," Wilma laughed. "Did you think that I wanted to offer you intimacy?" Wilma looked at her and the girl blushed. "Okay, I should be more clear. Will you come work for me as a maid?" the man asked. "Do you need a maid?" "Well, you could say that," Wilma nodded. "I do have a maid, but she doesn't suit me very well." "What's wrong with her?" Corey inquired. "What if I'm not right for you for the same reason?" "I hope that's not the case," the man smiled. "My former maid is, shall we say, overstepping her boundaries. But I'd still like to know what skills you have." Corey was silent for about half a minute, and then she said, "I did 4 years of medical school, but I quit as soon as I found out I was pregnant, and my boyfriend betrayed me." "Oh!" Wilma exclaimed. "Why didn't you take a leave of absence?" "Well, everything came at once. I just couldn't take it." "I see," he said, and then it hit him. "What if I hire this girl as a nurse for Tio? 4 completed courses is something," Wilma thought, and, explaining the situation, offered Corey a job. "Oh, no," she was afraid. "I'm afraid that I can't handle it." "Didn't they teach you anything in medical school?" Wilmer widened his eyes and added, "I can't believe in this." Corey kept refusing, but the natural gift of persuasion possessed by the businessman did its job. When the girl agreed, she felt both joy and shame at the same time. Just minutes ago she didn't want to live, and now she had found a job and a roof over her head. You never know where you'll find it or where you'll lose it. Ingrid, on the other hand, was furious. She did not take the stranger's appearance in the house easily. "Why do you need this homeless woman?" exclaimed Wilmer's perplexed wife. "Why the hell did you bring her? She'll only make things worse." "What makes you say that?" Wilmer asked calmly. "Corey has an unfinished medical degree, and if she had finished medical school, she would be an excellent therapist." "That most important word is unfinished." Ingrid said it angrily. "Ingrid, do you really think I'd hire Corey if she didn't have any knowledge at all? We had a chat during the ride, and then we visited Tio's doctor. He has instructed Corey, and he is convinced she is the right person for the job." "I don't know," the wife threw in irritably. "She is just an undergraduate doctor, and she's pregnant. Honestly, I was shocked by your decision." "Darling, I know how careful you are about Tio, but trust me, everything will be fine," Wilmer assured her. "I don't think so," Ingrid thought, but said nothing. Corey gave the impression of a person who knows her job. Despite not being a qualified doctor, she quickly made the same diagnosis as the visiting doctor. Corey noticed that the child's living quarters were excessively damp. "Most likely, his frequent illnesses are due to this," she suggested. "Changing the room and belongings should improve the situation without the need to move to the camp." What a smart-ass, Ingrid thought angrily. She wanted nothing more than to avoid living under the same roof as some ragamuffin. However, Wilmer stood his ground. His intuition told him Corey's presence would bring benefits, and he was right. Tio loved Corey, if not as his own mother, but as a good, kind relative, for sure. But as they say, trust but verify. Wilmer decided to reassure himself by installing a camera. First, he needed to confirm Corey's trustworthiness. Secondly, he could monitor his son's well-being during his business trips. While in the office, Wilmer periodically reviewed the footage and was satisfied. Corey fulfilled her duties perfectly, and the child was not disappointed in her. The problem was only with Ingrid. Wilmer was no fool and suspected that his wife was unhappy with the young nurse's presence. Ingrid tried to convince him of the nurse's lack of professionalism, and the man felt that something else was behind her attitude. Maybe Ingrid is just jealous, Wilmer thought. When he first saw Corey, he didn't pay much attention to her appearance. However, when she had tidied herself up and wore new clothes bought with his advance payment, Wilmer noticed that she was quite attractive. Corey had a long, light blonde hair, slightly slanted, bright blue eyes, soft, pink, puffy lips, and a natural blush. Ingrid was beautiful as well, of course, but her beauty was the result of the work of a stylist, makeup artist, and hairdresser. People like Ingrid are usually considered stunning, but not beautiful. Perhaps that was the issue. I should bring Ingrid a more expensive gift from my business trip, Wilmer thought. She loves that, and then we can travel somewhere to relax. I have to go on a business trip tomorrow, Wilmer announced during dinner. It will be for a couple of weeks. Can you manage without me? Sure, honey, Ingrid nodded. You can be sure that there won't be any unpleasant surprises from my side. With that, she cast an unkind glance at Corey. Wilmer sighed quietly. Here we go again. As he continued to observe his son and the nurse, the man became more convinced that this girl was a godsend. Corey spent almost the entire day with Tio, showing genuine interest in his well-being. She regularly measured his body temperature and administered the prescribed medication. In short, she performed her duties to the best of her ability. And as for qualifications, she will definitely get her degree in her time. But now Wilmer could only hope that Ingrid would change her attitude towards Corey with time. "What unpleasant surprises are you talking about?" Wilma smiled. "The main thing is that you get along." "Dad, Corey and I have already got along well," smiled Theo. "Well, that's great," his father concluded. Ingrid continued to eat dinner with a sour expression. It wasn't that she was jealous of the nurse taking care of her stepson, but she feared that this obscure newcomer with supposed medical education might threaten her position. Ingrid saw only one way to get rid of the despised nurse: to frame her. But how? That was the question. Never mind, the young woman thought optimistically. There will be a way, eventually. "By the way," Ingrid said to Corey as soon as her husband had left for his business trip, "from now on, you will eat in the kitchen." "Okay," the nurse shrugged, but the boy resisted. "No, Corey will eat with us." "Theo, while your daddy is away, it will be as I say," retorted the stepmother. "No," the boy frowned. "You little brat." Ingrid wanted to scold her stepson, but hesitated upon remembering the camera. It was one thing to put the staff in their place, and quite another to yell at the child. Wilma never forgave anyone for that. "Theo," she said in a sugary voice, "it's necessary. Corey will eat in the kitchen. After all, the gardener and the guard eat in the kitchen, and there's nothing wrong." "No," the child said, standing his ground, "and you are bad." "Theo, there is no need to argue," said the nurse, sitting down on the jacket. "I'll eat in the kitchen, and then as usual I'll come to you. It's really no big deal." "All right," the boy nodded after a little thought. After breakfast, Corey took Theo out for a walk. Meanwhile, Ingrid tried to solve the issue with that suddenly appearing nurse. "Think, Ingrid, think," she said mentally to herself. "There must be some way of evicting this beggar from here." She went up to her stepson's room, intending once more to air his room, and just then her gaze fell on the camera. Of course, how could I not have thought of that? Cunning Ingrid's plan was a piece of cake. She purposely placed her purse in the boy's room so that it could be visible on the camera. Ingrid was sure that Corey would take the purse and return it to her, and then she would be able to convince her husband that his protégé was an ordinary thief. The plan was right. Corey noticed the purse and, assuming it belonged to Ingrid, decided to return it. "Is this yours, Ingrid?" she said, holding out her find. "To you, I'm Mrs. Castro," the woman said arrogantly. "Mrs. Castro, is this your purse?" With faint irony, the nurse repeated her question. "Mine," Ingrid nodded, and opening it, she exclaimed, "It's empty! Where is my money?" "Well, I don't know that." Corey said it resolutely, guessing what the arrogant woman was hinting at. "I found this purse in Theo's room and brought it to you at once. Whether it was empty or had something in it, I didn't look. But I did, and there were $1,000 and credit cards in there. Oh, you've cleaned it out." "Well, yeah, I'm such a fool to take the money and return your empty purse," Corey remarked with a chuckle. After all, she was human, and would not allow anyone to humiliate her or even accuse her of something she didn't do. "How should I know what's in your head?" grumbled Ingrid, adding, "I think you went somewhere away from the camera, took everything out, and then you pretended you weren't involved. Get out of here. Thieves don't belong in a decent home, and with the money you've stolen, you can count it as your severance pay." "But I didn't take any money," retorted Corey, and her voice trembled. "I don't want to listen to your lie," Ingrid said, with her brow raised. "But if you don't get out of here within 15 minutes, you'll have to explain everything in the police station. Believe me, it'll be more difficult for you." "Who do you think they'll believe? Me, the wife of a decent businessman, or some beggar half-doctor?" Corey realized that it was useless to argue and went to her room to pack her things. Ingrid followed her and watched Corey packing, triumphantly. Everything had gone according to her brilliantly simple plan. The nurse, swallowing her tears, left the room and left the house. She was glad that Tio hadn't seen her leaving, but the rest of her life was bad. The little money she had in her wallet was enough only for a couple of nights in the cheapest hostel, and Corey was again faced with the problem of what to do. When Wilma heard from Ingrid about Corey's crime, he was discouraged, to say the least. He didn't want to believe it, and he couldn't. He had helped the poor woman as a human being, and she had repaid him. That was beyond his understanding of and faith in people. After watching the tape, he was convinced that his son's nurse had taken Ingrid's wallet from the table. But did Corey take money from it? That was the question. On the other hand, Wilma had no reason not to trust his wife. Yes, Ingrid disliked the nurse from first sight, but baseless accusations would be too much even for the disgruntled Ingrid. Besides, Ingrid loved Tio, wished him well, and couldn't help but notice that Corey's presence at their house was good for him. Yes, the camera couldn't confirm the exact fact of the theft, but the fact that Corey had the purse in her hands was pure truth. You know, when a person is tight on money, they may go for a lot more than that, Ingrid said. How do you know what kind of trouble she's really in? Maybe she owed someone money. What do you know about her besides what she told you? Nothing. Wilma knew that his wife definitely had a point. No matter how much you feed the wolf, he's still looking in the woods. So it is sadly true to admit, most likely Corey did steal the money. After the conversation with her husband, Ingrid drank white wine with exotic fruits and gloated. She'd gotten what she wanted. You've lived in a decent house and slept on clean sheets. It's time to return to your usual good-for-nothing life, Ingrid thought viciously. Where's Corey? Tio asked when his stepmother entered his room in the evening. Corey doesn't work for us anymore. Ingrid shrugged and opened the window. Why? The child asked plaintively. Because your darling Corey has stolen my money, said the stepmother eagerly. You're lying. Corey's good. You're bad. If you don't want to believe it, I don't care, Ingrid said, grinning. Close the window, please, Tio asked. I'm cold. All right, replied the stepmother after a little hesitation, and she closed the window. The next day the boy felt sick again. I feel bad, Tio complained. Well, what's the matter with you again? Ingrid rolled her eyes. The boy was all red, and his eyes shone with an unhealthy glow. Give me the syrup, Tio asked quietly. What kind of syrup? You don't even know what kind of syrup, exclaimed the boy in despair. Why did you kick Corey out? I've already explained to you that she's a thief, Ingrid said, and then, looking sternly at the boy, added, Not another word about her, do you understand? Tio was smart beyond his years, and guessed that he would not get what he wanted. It's better to wait for Daddy. The stepmother gave the syrup and left the room. She wanted to open the window, but the boy said that he was very cold, and Ingrid did not do it. Tio began to wither, and it wasn't just the illness. The boy felt that only Corey really cared for him. Daddy, of course, also loved him very much, but he worked a lot and could not spend enough time with him. Ingrid didn't care about him. All she cared about was her own person and Wilma's money. As for Corey, after such a dishonourable discharge, she had fallen on hard times. After spending 2 nights in a hostel, she went in search of some kind of accommodation. She hoped that the world wouldn't be left without kind people. What if someone will take me in for a loan? Corey thought hopefully, or offer to help them with household chores in exchange for a roof over my head? However, Corey's hopes were fading by the minute. There was no one willing to lend her a corner. Still, Corey tried not to despair. What else could she do? She decided to visit the neighbourhood where she and Steve had rented an apartment. People often rented out apartments there, for very low prices, because no one wanted to live there since it was a very criminal district. And miraculously she got lucky. However, it was hardly to be called real luck. The man who agreed to lend Corey the tiny apartment lived in the next one, and he was a heavy drunkard. The apartment was filthy and smelled of stale cigarette smoke, but of course it was better than living on the street. "I expect money in a month," said the drunk landlord. "Deal," nodded Corey, heartily hoping to find some work. The main thing was not to inform the potential employer about her pregnancy. During her job search, her landlord would visit her home from time to time and ask about money. "But it hasn't been a month yet, has it?" Corey invariably answered, suspecting that the man needed money for the booze. And the sooner the better. Finally, Corey managed to get a job at a food delivery service. "We pay weekly," the administrator informed her, and Corey nodded happily. She couldn't have dreamed of such luck. The pay was good, and by her calculations, she should pay the rent on time. After working for a week, Corey filled the fridge and put aside money for the rent. But unfortunately, that was the end of her bright streak. One day she got sick at work. Corey was leaving the shopping centre loaded with products that she was to deliver, and fainted. The frightened administrator called an ambulance. "Well, in your condition it's not normal to carry such heavy weights," said the doctor. "You're at risk of miscarriage, so you'll have to stay here for a couple of days." Corey sighed heavily. She had only worked 2 days this week, and wondered if she would be paid for her work. No work again, no money, Corey thought sadly. And how will I pay the rent? The only positive thing was that the hospital was much more comfortable than the shabby apartment. She called the landlord and asked him to wait an extra week, mentioning she had gotten to the hospital. Of course, he was already being overly kind to her, but she was hoping for his extra favour. However, this time the man didn't want to get into the poor woman's problems. "I don't care. Do you have any money at all?" he interrupted Corey's stream of complaints. "Yes, in the kitchen cupboard, under the blue teapot," she replied, hoping that the landlord would be convinced of her solvency and make concessions. What a naive girl she was. "That's good," the man said, visibly pleased, and added, "I take all the money. That's 1 month's pay and my moral compensation for the long wait. And you should not come back here again. I don't need such irresponsible tenants here. Where can I get the key?" "At the city hospital," Corey answered gloomily. "I'll leave it with the lady on duty." "Why aren't you eating?" Ingrid asked, watching her stepson pick at a plate of pasta with a frown. "I don't want to," Theo mumbled, defiantly pushing the plate away. The boy longed for Corey very much, but realised that he shouldn't talk about her with his stepmother, otherwise she would start cursing and calling her a thief again. "How are you?" Wilma cheerfully asked the household upon returning from a business trip. "Fine," purred Ingrid, kissing her husband. "Yeah?" he smiled. "That's great. Where's Theo?" "He's in his room," she replied. Seeing his son, Wilma froze with his mouth open. To be honest, he didn't even immediately recognise Theo. The boy had turned pale, shriveled up, and looked unfortunate. "Are you sick again?" the worried father asked. "Dad, can Corey come back?" replied the boy, a tear rolling down his pale cheek. Wilma was confused. "Sonny, I would love for her to come back, but it's impossible," he replied in despair. Wilma looked at his wife, as if asking her if Theo knew about the theft. Ingrid barely nodded. "Daddy, I know that Ingrid thinks Corey stole the money," said the shrewd child. "But that's not true. She's good, and Ingrid is bad. I was cold, and she opened the window." "What are you talking about? A good or bad?" Ingrid couldn't take it any more. If only it were that simple. "Ingrid, don't yell at the child," Wilma said quietly but firmly. "I'm sorry," she stammered, "but you should understand." "I understand," said the husband. "When I left, Tio got sick again. Isn't that a reason to listen to his request?" Ingrid couldn't believe her ears. "Are you going to hire her again?" The wife marvelled. "If it would really help, yes. And then I'd still like to hear the other side of this case." Without delay, Wilma began his search for Corey. It didn't seem easy, as she had no permanent address. All he had was the address of the apartment she shared with the father of her child, but they had broken up, and it was unlikely she would go back to him after such a betrayal. Though she might have acquaintances there, it's worth a try, Wilma reasoned. There are no other clues yet. The neighbourhood looked shabby, and the successful businessman looked like a man from another world on its streets. Wilma showed Corey's picture to the locals, but people just shrugged their shoulders. He was about to leave the place empty-handed when luck smiled on him. "Yes, I saw this girl yesterday," nodded a woman of about 40 in a flowered dress and a washed-out sweater. "She rented an apartment in that house over there, on the first floor." "Thank you very much." He thanked the woman, and he went to the building she had indicated. Wilma came to the entrance, and, seeing 3 drunken men, he asked, "Guys, have any of you rented an apartment out to a woman named Corey?" "Well, let's say it's me," one of them replied and smiled, showing the remaining 4 teeth. "Let's say, or is it really you?" "Yes, she was my tenant," the man replied, looking at Wilma with interest. "He's clearly hoping to get some money from me," the businessman guessed. "Well, whatever you ask, as long as the information is useful." And the information was indeed important. For $50, Wilma found out that Corey had rented an apartment from that drunkard, but he had asked her to vacate the premises due to lack of payment. "And where could she be now, do you know?" asked Wilma, not hoping for an answer. "The day before yesterday, she was in the city hospital. She called and tried to get me to wait another week. I said no. I'm not a charity organisation." "I see." Wilma nodded again, and taking money out of his wallet, walked away. What kind of jerk would you have to be to kick a pregnant woman out of an apartment? Wilma thought with indignation, although what else could I expect from a marginal? However, he was more interested in another point. If Corey, as Ingrid assured him, had stolen the money, then how come she had nothing to pay for this shanty place? The answer was self-evident. Corey hadn't stolen anything, and Ingrid hadn't paid her a penny. Wilma was terribly embarrassed. Corey had worked for him for almost a whole month. She'd done her job perfectly, and Tio not only recovered, but also became attached to her. "I just have to find her," thought Wilma, and he went to the city hospital, praying that Corey was there. "Threatened miscarriage." Corey smiled sadly, and the businessman's heart snapped. "From nervousness. 1-to-1, and I ended up getting sick right at work. That's how I ended up here." Wilma mentally grabbed his head. It wasn't what he wanted for the woman who worked for him, if they did it well. "At work?" He raised his eyebrows in bewilderment. "Yeah," she nodded. "I started looking for a new one after Ingrid had kicked me out, and I got a job at a delivery service." "Corey, this very dismissal is what I want to talk to you about," Wilma began. "It's a very delicate issue, and—" Wilma stopped talking, not knowing what to say next. Corey came to his rescue. "Mr. Castro, I didn't take your wife's purse." "Well, I did, but I didn't look inside. I just wanted to give it to her." There was desperation in Corey's voice, and the businessman believed it was true. "I believe you," he said quietly, "and I want to suggest that we go back. Agreed?" "But your wife won't let me work," Corey said uncertainly. "I'll take care of my wife." "Good. Then I agree," Corey nodded. "Well, now rest and take care of yourself." He smiled. "We're looking forward to seeing you." The doctors made great efforts, and Corey's pregnancy was saved. Wilma and Tio came to her discharge together. I'm very glad you're coming back, said little Tio, looking at her seriously. Seeing Corey, Ingrid pressed her lips together unhappily, but said nothing. She did not know what she should do. Oh, these beggars! They are rarely tenacious creatures, thought Ingrid grudgingly. You close the door, they come in through the window. There was nothing to think of setting Corey up again. Wilma wouldn't believe it anyway. Tio began to recover quickly, his cheeks rounded and rosy. He loved to go for walks with his nanny. They went to the zoo, amusement park, and other hot spots for the youngest visitors. And once Tio and Corey went to the park, they found a puppy there, took him in, and named him Finn. Wilma was happy, but something was still bothering him. But what was it? Corey, you are simply a magician, he said one day. Tio seems to have recovered, gotten stronger, and he is really happier now than before. What are you doing with him? Miracles, that's what. Oh, no miracles, the girl replied, embarrassed. Tio was moved to another room. That was the first step. Optimal air temperature plus carefully selected medications. That's all the miracles. At the mention of temperature, Wilma suddenly remembered his son's words about Ingrid. I was cold and she opened the window. Probably that's what caused his constant illness, Wilma thought. Wilma had often puzzled over why his child's room was damp. His first thought was that perhaps the builders had made a mistake somewhere, resulting in increased humidity and as a result frequent colds. Wilma even thought about filing a lawsuit against the construction company. Then suddenly, a terrible thought settled in his mind. What if Ingrid was intentionally cooling down Tio's room? She also insisted that I send him to a health camp. But why? Wilma realized that he couldn't easily accuse his wife of such a thing, so he decided to order an independent examination. In his heart, there was a hope that he was wrong, and that he couldn't marry a woman capable of deliberately harming his son's health. It should be noted that the relationship between the spouses became strained. One day, Ingrid casually brought up the topic of whether it was inappropriate for the servants to eat at the same table as the hosts. The servants? Maybe, Wilma nodded calmly. But Corey has become a member of our family for Tio and me. She cured my son, for which I will be grateful to her for the rest of my life. Ingrid frowned, and then tears rolled out from her eyes. Okay, I finally get it. Since you don't need me here anymore, it's time for us to end this charade. Wilma, I'm filing for divorce. I can't be married to a man who doesn't love me at all. With these words, she got up and ran upstairs to her bedroom. Of course, Ingrid had no intention of getting a divorce. It was just a manipulation, and Ingrid hoped that Wilma would chase after her and beg for forgiveness. And then her only condition would be to fire Corey. However, Ingrid turned out to be a poor manipulator. Wilma willingly signed the divorce agreement and, moreover, said that he intended to give Ingrid everything she was entitled to, which was nothing. Being a foresighted man, Wilma grew up with a prenuptial agreement, and as a result, the greedy lady was left with nothing. Be grateful that I didn't accuse you of taking all the money from the safe. Wilma said this after the divorce process. And you thought I wouldn't notice anything? Ingrid gave her ex-husband a hateful look, but it didn't make any impression on him. Well, my dear, note that it wasn't me who filed for divorce. Wilma grinned. And here, as a memento. The former husband handed her the results of an independent examination. Goodbye. I wish you happiness in your search for another fool. To hell with you, said Ingrid angrily as she walked away, her heels clacking loudly. How could I have failed so stupidly? Well, I'll make life fun for you. You forget worldly wisdom. He laughs best when he laughs last. That same evening, armed with a can of gasoline and a lighter, Ingrid went to the house where she had been living. Corey and Theo were playing board games, while Finn was happily wandering around. Wilma was due back any minute. "It smells burnt," the boy remarked. Corey sniffed and also noticed a burning smell, and the next second she was horrified to see flames through the window. "Corey, I'm scared," cried Theo. "Calm down, my darling, stay calm," she said soothingly, picking up the boy and running towards the exit. They couldn't waste any time, as the fire would soon block their way to safety. Corey placed Theo on the grass, stood away from the fire, and took a moment to catch her breath. "I've already called the fire department," the neighbour said, running up to them. "There's Finn," Theo squealed. Corey couldn't leave the poor pet to die. Without hesitation, she rushed back into the blazing heat. A few minutes later, a deafening explosion was heard, and the house collapsed like a house of cards. Driving along his street, Wilma Castro couldn't believe his eyes. The house that he had poured his heart and soul into was engulfed in flames. The man sped up his car. "Where's my son?" he shouted, jumping out of the car. "The boy's at the neighbour's," one of the firefighters said, and Wilma rushed towards the neighbour's house, hoping that Corey and the dog were safe too. "Corey," the little one stammered, overwhelmed with shock. "And Finn. They took her to the hospital and she's seriously hurt." Wilma rushed to the hospital and found out that Corey was in stable condition. Her hands and feet were slightly burned, but in general, her life and pregnancy were not in danger. As luck would have it, a second before the house collapsed, Corey had left the house through the emergency exit in the kitchen. Wilma sat by Corey's bedside, who was sleeping under sedation, and holding her hand, looked at her with a worried look. Only now he realized how attached he had become to this girl. "I never had time to tell you that I love you," Wilma whispered and gently squeezed Corey's palm. The house was destroyed by the fire and couldn't be rebuilt. Fortunately, it was insured. Security cameras captured her setting the fire. They couldn't put her in jail because Ingrid was declared insane and placed in a psychiatric hospital. Corey was getting better every day. One day, Wilma came to visit her with Theo. "Why did you risk your life like that?" the man asked. "But it's your son's favourite puppy, and we found him in the park and tamed him. And as you know, we are responsible for those we have tamed," replied Corey with a smile. "Then you're responsible for me, Corey. After this accident, I have realized that you have become very dear to me, and I will not let you go anywhere else. If you let me, of course," whispered the man in love, taking her hands in his. Corey underwent a rehabilitation course. The lovers got married, and on New Year's Eve, she suddenly felt that happy motherhood was only hours away. And soon a little baby girl was born. This new year became the best in the life of Wilma Castro. After all, his family became truly happy and bigger, and it was worth living for. Brandon was clicking the buttons on the remote control, switching TV channels, but he couldn't find anything good to watch in the evening except the news. Outside the window, a magnificent July sunset painted the sky, and the man could smell the heat of the day and the sea salt wafting in from the open window. He could enjoy mountains, beautiful nature, heat 6 months a year, fishing, plenty of fruit and sunshine to his heart's content. However, Brandon was annoyed by the hustle and bustle of the tourist town. He appeared on the seashore only once a season. The heat made him dizzy, even the waves at the shore made him nauseous, and hiking in the mountains was like torture for the man. Every time his friends suggested it, he dismissed the idea, and instead went to the nearest pub in the evening to sit down with a bottle of cold, foaming beer and forget himself in the monotonous murmurs of the TV. "Brandon, please come to me and hold the colander for me so I can drain the pasta," his wife Maya called from the kitchen. Brandon fidgeted unhappily in his armchair. His wife always interrupted at the most inappropriate times with her stupid requests, such as taking out the garbage, helping with cleaning, sharpening knives, watching the porridge. Brandon put on his slippers and went to the kitchen. "Here, hold it over the sink," Maya asked, grabbing the hot pan handles with a towel. "Can't you do it yourself? Just put it in the sink and pour as much as you want," snapped Brandon, but still held the colander. Brandon grew up in a family where his mother and older sister did everything around the house and in the kitchen. He was never asked to peel potatoes or wash dishes, as his mother believed it was not a man's job. His clothes were always washed, ironed, and neatly folded in the boys' closet. By the end of school, Brandon had no idea how to tuck a blanket into a duvet cover, how long to boil dumplings, or how to clean dirt off shoes. Like his father, he upheld family traditions and only went into the kitchen to check if the soup or roast was ready. His father's occupation as a blacksmith compensated for it. It was a rare profession by modern standards, but still relevant and well paid. Little Brandon often hung around his father's blacksmith shop, where he skillfully bent iron bars or forged ornate monograms for another fence. It was not surprising that after his father retired from business, Brandon took over the family business and became a blacksmith himself. At first, the guy was enthusiastic about the business, and there were plenty of orders. The locals knew and remembered Brandon's father's skill, so they returned with new jobs. However, Brandon's craft was not as skillful as his father's, and in a few years he tarnished the reputation of his distinguished relative. It's not that he couldn't do blacksmithing at all, but his work wasn't as light and elegantly airy as his father's. As a result, the business declined, and Brandon eventually resorted to forging souvenirs for tourists, occasionally taking orders for fences and gates. Despite having a steady income, Brandon firmly held the belief that it was shameful for a man to do so-called women's work. His mother and sister were soon replaced by his wife Maya, a modest math tutor. At first it seemed like Brandon had chosen the perfect wife. Beautiful, slender, unobtrusive, a great cook, and she didn't demand anything in particular. But over time the situation changed, and Maya began to advocate for equal responsibilities. Brandon was standing on his ground. No hunger strike or week of eating dumplings from the grocery shop. No room filled with dirt could change his mind. He stubbornly sat in his chair after work and refused to pick up a mop or a rag, considering it beneath his dignity. "Oh, we don't have any cabbage for the salad," Maya exclaimed, looking into the empty vegetable drawer in the refrigerator. "Brandon, please go around the corner to the vegetable shop." Brandon, about to go back to watching TV, rolled his eyes, expressing extreme displeasure. "No way! You stay at home all day, and you should remember to stock up on groceries. You'd think a couple of hours of video chatting a day is hard work. I'm not going," Brandon muttered. "Then you mix the pasta and gravy, sprinkle on the cheese and herbs, and I'll go to the store in the meantime," Maya said patiently. "What else?" the blacksmith snorted. "Should I clean the floors too?" "That would be nice," Maya said patiently. Instead of answering, Brandon went into his bedroom, scuffing his slippers on the linoleum. Maya sighed and started cooking. Today they will have dinner without salad, as it had been many times before. Later that evening, Maya sat at her friend's house drinking tea and complaining about her lazy husband. "Is he still refusing to help?" Casey asked, diligently squeezing lemon into her tea. "You know how he is," Maya sighed, sitting across from her and unwrapping a chocolate candy. "He doesn't even want to talk about cleaning or the kitchen." "Look, just leave him alone. There are so many handsome tourists here." Casey nodded meaningfully at the window. "And why do I need them, these handsome men?" Maya answered in the tone of her friend. "Brandon may be grumpy, but he works all year round, brings money into the house and does a good job. and re-educating is just a matter of time, and the main reason is that I love him. I can't help it. Well, how long have you been trying to re-educate your precious Brandon? 5 years or more? Casey stared at her friend. Maya sighed, realizing her friend was right. Stubborn, Brandon refused to change. But 5 years ago, Maya didn't think it would be such a problem. Back then, Brandon appeared before her as a romanticized knight. On their first date, he even crafted a rose out of thin sheet iron for her, and Maya melted. Her mother always told her that marriage was a lifelong commitment, that she needed to accept her husband's character and show patience and understanding. These same qualities were instilled in her as a teacher and during her time at college. Naive Maya sincerely believed in her mother's advice and the recommendations of her professors. She talked, tried to provide examples and evidence, and compared situations, but it was all in vain. Instead of finding a compromise, the domestic war with her husband only wore her down more and more. "Dear, you should stop eating candy," Casey gently stopped her friend. "Why?" Maya played dumb, even though she knew exactly what her friend meant. "Because you have to buy a new closet soon, and I'm your best friend. So I'm sorry, I'm telling you like it is," Casey mumbled tactlessly. Maya took a large gulp of tea. Casey was right. The more intense the conflict with Brandon became, the more she indulged in eating. She used to run in the mornings and visit her students' homes, but eventually switched to working from home, leading to a decline in her physical activity. Her body responded by gaining extra pounds. "Stop pretending that everything is normal." Casey leaned in and whispered, "Take control of yourself and lose weight." "I'll have to cook separate meals for myself," Maya said sadly. "I'll be stuck in the kitchen all the time, and Brandon won't eat salads and boiled chicken breast." "He can survive on a couple of cucumbers and apples, and, by the way, he can cook for himself. And you'll be even more beautiful," Casey encouraged her, "although, in my opinion, you have no one to try for," she added under her breath, making sure her friend couldn't hear. Maya looked out the window, where a small piece of the sparkling sea was visible. On one hand, she knew her friend was right, and it was time to lose weight. But on the other hand, she longed for harmony, ease, and support from her husband. Then she could easily go on a diet and run around the neighborhood again in the mornings, while it was not too hot. While she couldn't make a firm decision, the candy in the vase continued to dwindle. Brandon was working in the workshop when a snow-white luxury car pulled up to the gate and a beautiful young woman got out of it. "Hello, I need a beautiful wrought iron fence. Can you do that?" "Good afternoon." Brandon hurriedly removed his gloves and wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Yes, I can." Visitors like her were rare in his workshop. The woman was dressed in an exquisite suit, high heels, and she had perfectly styled hair. "Do you have a catalogue with your works or examples?" the woman asked. Brandon hurriedly handed her a folder containing all his father's works. The woman flipped through a few pages and pointed her finger at the intricate fence with curlicues and olive branches. "How much does this one cost?" Brandon stated the approximate cost per metre. It was his father's best work, one that had made him famous far beyond their state. Brandon didn't even consider the possibility of someone wanting to replicate it. When she heard the price, the woman smiled. "Great, it suits me. Do you need something from me, like a prepayment or contacts?" "Yes, I need to make measurements and receive a partial prepayment for the purchase of metal," confirmed Brandon, already rejoicing in the prospect of a successful deal. The woman nodded and handed him a business card. "Call me tomorrow when you're available to come. See you then," the girl said, and then got into her car and drove away. Only when the car disappeared around the corner did Brandon finally look at the business card in his hand. It had gold-coloured letters on a white, cramped background. "Vanessa Staplehorst, lawyer." Brandon greedily studied the business card, which faintly smelled of perfume. That evening, Brandon returned home in a nervous and euphoric state. He rushed from one place to another, digging into his laptop, constantly checking metal prices, and swirling the customer's business card in his fingers. His eyes were burning. Maya couldn't help but notice it at dinner. "Why are you so happy?" she casually asked her husband while putting meatballs on his plate. "I got an important order, and I'm worried not to ruin the deal," replied Brandon. "Oh, that's great," exclaimed Maya. "And who placed the order?" Suddenly, Brandon lost control of his senses due to the barrage of questions from his wife. "What kind of interrogation is this? I already told you it's an important order. Why are you pestering me like a leech?" He swung his palm so vigorously that he knocked the plate and dinner to the floor. Maya pressed her lips together and ran for a broom. Brandon sat on the chair, motionless, while his wife was picking food off the floor and crawling under the refrigerator with a mop, trying to retrieve the meatball. The man silently watched the woman he was married to. He noticed the unsightly folds protruding from under the elastic band of her shorts. Her hands with short nails were without manicure. She had a perpetual ponytail on her head. "I'll sleep in the living room tonight," he informed a disappointed Maya, and left, taking a mug of tea with him. The woman was left sitting on the floor with a mass of questions in her head and shards of the broken plate in her hands. The next day he called Vanessa in the morning, for some reason adding a noble hoarseness to his voice, and arranged to take a measurement at noon. Maya looked at him in surprise, rubbing her eyes from sleep. Brandon had already woken up at 8 a.m. and wandered nervously around the kitchen. He gulped down a mug of coffee and ate 2 sandwiches with sprats and cucumber, which his wife had made without complaint, despite yesterday's incident. Then he put on a colourful shirt and some decent shorts, gathered some documents, jumped into his old BMW, and confidently set off. He had to get to the new prestigious area 70 kilometres from his tourist town. "Why did I eat those sprats? Now I smell fishy," Brandon muttered to himself while driving. He clicked the air conditioner button on the panel, trying to beat the southern heat. Then he searched the glove compartment for a mint or at least water, but alas, it was empty. Already on the way to the customer's house, Brandon stopped the car at a store and bought all kinds of refreshing candies. Why he did it, the man couldn't clearly say. Normally, Brandon didn't care about things like whether he ate onions in his salad for lunch. But today was a special day. Vanessa's house was new, neat, and quite modern. Brandon gathered his strength and rang the bell. "Good afternoon. I'm glad you made it here in this heat. Would you like some iced tea?" The hostess appeared on the doorstep almost immediately, as if she had been waiting for the signal to open the door. "Hello. Honestly, I wouldn't say no," slightly embarrassed. Vanessa, wearing long, light pants and a lacy top, invited him into the house. She sat him at the kitchen table and placed a filled glass with a straw in front of him. "I can make a larger down payment so that you can get started on my order as soon as possible," Vanessa said, taking a seat across from him. "You know, living defenseless alone in a big house and relying only on a door is a dubious idea." "I understand you," Brandon nodded, mentally replaying the last phrase of the pretty customer in his head. "Then let's draw up a contract," Vanessa asked. "Contract? I haven't even calculated the amount of work yet." The master smiled perplexedly. Vanessa smiled and took Brandon to the yard to make all the needed measurements. The blacksmith quickly coped with the task, although thoughts about the beautiful customer swarmed like flies in front of his eyes. A little work with a calculator, a couple of sketches in a working notebook with the location of patterns, details of welding and fasteners, and the sum came out so high that Brandon hesitated slightly before voicing it. Then he gathered his thoughts, paused, and told Vanessa the cost of her choice. To his surprise, the woman only nodded and waved her hand at the door, signalling that she was ready to sign the papers. When the terms were approved, the papers were filled out, and Brandon received the prepayment. There was an awkward silence. Vanessa was obviously in no hurry to send him off, and the man didn't want to leave either. The girl gave him a strange, appraising look, which sent a chill down Brandon's spine. "Would you mind giving me a little help?" Vanessa asked, finally tilting her head to the side. "I'll be glad if I can be of any more help," Brandon agreed, swallowing his saliva. "The important papers of one of my defendants fell behind the closet in my bedroom. Will you help this fragile girl move it and retrieve the documents?" Vanessa asked, slapping her thick eyelashes and speaking in the most innocent voice. Instead of answering, Brandon got up from the soft chair, and the woman led him deep into the house. Brandon arrived home late. Maya met him in stretched home shorts, with an algebra book in her hand, and this view did not fit in with his mood at all. Just a few hours ago, he had been embraced by a woman with a flawless body and an undeniably magnetic energy. And now he was back to the routine and the struggle of dividing household chores. Brandon sighed irritably. "Are you going to sleep separately again?" Maya asked cautiously, placing a plate of mashed potatoes and a fried chicken leg in front of him. "Yes," Brandon muttered. "I'm tired. It's a big order. I need to think it over." "So you got it after all. That's good." Maya clapped her hand with joy. In fact, the order was of the least interest to Brandon now. His thoughts were occupied by the woman who had managed to drive him crazy in one day, was firmly lodged in his head. Maya said something about her students, about the fact that children didn't want to study in the summer, about discounts in the grocery store, and about the neighbours. Brandon didn't listen. Even when she asked him to wipe the crumbs off the table, he didn't snap in his usual tone, but just went into his room silently. Maya, perplexed, shrugged her shoulders. Brandon remembered the day not as a day of money, but as a day of love. It was the beginning of his passionate affair with Vanessa. Every day he told his wife that he was going to the workshop, but instead he drove to his mistress. Beyond the threshold of her house, the world that Brandon had long dreamed of began, a world of pleasures where no speck of everyday life could penetrate. Vanessa was 2 years older than him. She was unmarried, childless, and had devoted herself to her career. At age 33, she moved to the coast and bought a house. She skillfully maintained the image of a simple girl, but also skillfully transformed back when the situation demanded it. Vanessa was not accustomed to begging and waiting to be told what to do. She just took, did, went, and spoke first if she needed. This woman was unlike Brandon was used to, but that was what drew him in and fascinated him. 2 weeks of passion went by, which Brandon had to suppress within himself each time he crossed the threshold of his home, and each time it became more and more difficult for him. Brandon didn't even start working on the order. He cared so little about everything around him, except for Vanessa. The fateful evening arrived unexpectedly. After another daytime rendezvous at his mistress's house, Brandon sat down at the table and glumly looked at his wife. Maya was rambling in her usual manner about the news she had learned during the day and neighbourhood gossip. She placed a plate of pea soup sprinkled with dill in front of him and put bread in a basket. The man stared into the plate and noticed that his wife had cut stems into the soup instead of leaves. "What kind of wife are you?" he exclaimed. "Am I supposed to eat logs?" "You know what? To hell all this and you. I'm leaving." "Where are you going?" Maya didn't understand. "As far away from here as possible." The man jumped up and rushed to pack his things. His wife watched in complete shock, confusion and disbelief as he quickly threw everything from the closet into a large travel bag. He then grabbed items from the bathroom, his laptop, work papers, charger cords and other small things, shoving them into his briefcase. "I'm tired and I'm leaving," Brandon declared, already standing on the doorstep with his belongings. "I'm sick of your moralizing and your interference. And Go get a manicure at least. As for me, I love another woman." Maya could only open her mouth and stagger to the poof in the hallway. The door slammed shut and footsteps were heard on the stairs. Everything that had just happened seemed like a foolish prank or a bad joke to her. The entire night, Maya was in despair, unable to sleep. She tried calling her husband to reason with him, but the phone said that the subscriber was unavailable. In the morning, Maya called her friend and asked her to come over. "So, your husband ran away?" Casey slammed her hand on the table. "Well, it's no big loss." "But what am I going to do now?" Maya sniffled. "It's my fault. I kept nagging him about the equal divisions of duties. I nagged him to the point where I lost him." "Hey, are you even listening to yourself?" Casey waved her hand in front of Maya's face. "He cheated on you, and you're worried about losing him? You should be happy to be rid of such a burden." "Well, my dear, stop crying," Casey consoled her. "Tears won't help your grief. Instead, think of it as losing nothing with the departure of this jerk." Maya looked at her friend with tearful eyes, with some surprise. "Well, look." Casey put her foot on her leg and began to curl her fingers. "You have your own apartment. You have a job. You will not starve. And you're a good-looking woman." "And Brandon said that I need a manicure. And in general, he constantly insinuated to me that I was fat," muttered Maya. "Darling, it's time to forget what your good-for-nothing husband said." Casey jokingly wagged her finger at her. That evening, Brandon loaded his few belongings into the car and drove to his parents' house. They lived on the other side of the town and were not too happy about their son's return, especially since he could not clearly explain why he decided to leave his wife. They put Brandon to sleep on the old sofa in the living room. His former room was occupied by his sister's little son. Brandon didn't sleep well in his father's house. He kept turning over what had happened in his head, evaluating the impulsiveness with which he had decided to leave. In the morning, thinking it over, Brandon decided that he was a man and was free to do as he pleased, and his decisions were obviously correct, so nothing terrible had happened. Early in the morning he jumped up, had a quick breakfast of his mother's pancakes, cleaned himself up, and not wanting to answer uncomfortable questions, went straight to his mistress. "Brandon!" Vanessa opened the door in a light robe. "Why are you here so early?" "I left my wife," the man joyfully told her the news, standing on the threshold. Contrary to his expectations, this fact didn't bring a smile to his mistress's face. Vanessa in general seemed not to react to him in any way. "Come in, I'll consult a client on the phone and we'll talk." She stepped forward, letting Brandon pass. He sat down on the sofa in the living room and waited for Vanessa to finish her morning work. Even in the hustle and bustle of the morning, she still looked gorgeous. Watching her, Brandon mentally praised himself for his decision. In the end, he couldn't resist, grabbed Vanessa's hand, who was wandering around the room with the phone in her hand, and sat her on his lap. She rounded her eyes, but continued talking about legal matters as if nothing had happened. "How's the work on my order coming along?" the woman asked when she finished talking. "I began to prepare the material, made sketches." Without blinking an eye, lied Brandon. In fact, he hadn't laid a finger on the metal he'd received, and in fact, the last time he'd been in the workshop was over a week ago. "Good," Vanessa nodded. "I'd like to get it as soon as possible, then I can feel myself safer." "You have me." Brandon tapped himself on the chest with his palm. "I don't doubt you." Vanessa removed a speck from his shoulder. "But it's better to have a fence anyway. Okay, let's get something to eat, and then I have to go to a meeting. I won't be here until tonight." The woman got up from Brandon's lap in a businesslike manner and walked to the kitchen. "I thought we'd be together now." Brandon stretched out with a slight disappointment. "I should do my work, honey," Vanessa replied deftly, slicing tomatoes, avocado and salmon. "Everyone has business. Business brings money. and everyone loves money. And by the way, you will have time to take care of my order. We can spend the evening and night together." Brandon was still a little upset. He was drinking a cappuccino, munching on a sandwich with copious toppings, and for the first time, he couldn't say anything against it. Only a cranky child or an idiot would be outraged in such a situation, and in the eyes of his mistress, Brandon didn't want to look like either of them. The workshop greeted him with the smell of welding, stifling heat, and the burden of obligation. Brandon's attitude towards work had changed since he started sleeping with the one who paid him. Normally the blacksmith would not waste any time and would start the order immediately. But now Brandon would rather shower the woman he loved with roses than sweat in the heat of the workshop, pounding with a hammer. However, the contract had been signed, and avoiding work could have serious consequences. No matter how infatuated he was, it was time for him to focus on business. Brandon put on an apron, sighed, and began adjusting his tools. Casey and Maya were sunbathing on a secluded beach in the hot afternoon. The sea quietly rustled the stones, its waves softly hissing and responding to the cries of seagulls. It playfully foamed at the edge, teasing small crabs sitting on several large boulders. "It's been a long time since I've been out for a swim with Brandon," said Maya. "I couldn't force him to come to the sea, and he was always against me going alone." "He's an idiot. How many times have I told you? Have you stopped grieving over that jerk yet?" "It's only been a week," Maya said. "But you know, the house is cleaner now, and I don't have to wash dishes as often." "My dear, you have no idea how many advantages and opportunities open up for an intelligent woman when she gets rid of a leech disguised as a husband." Casey said it in an edifying tone. Maya smiled, but deep down she was still offended and hurt by Brandon's behaviour. She always tried to uplift him, admired his achievements and supported him. Yes, she tried to instill in him a sense of order and an equal attitude towards any kind of work. But was that so bad? What if he files for divorce tomorrow? It would be such a disgrace. "Well, what's so shameful?" Casey grinned. "It's not shame that you should be thinking about, but the joy of regaining your freedom." "You love freedom too much," Maya remarked. "Of course," Casey perked up. "I have a profitable online job. I'm crazy about growing flowers and owe nothing to anyone. If I want, I can go for a walk until dawn. And if I want, I can binge-watch series all day long. No need to cook 3 pots of soup, deal with someone else's dirty laundry. Try living for yourself. I assure you, you'll love it." Maya put her hands behind her head and, through her dark glasses, began to contemplate the coastline. Her friend was right, and Maya was starting to see things differently. She remembered that the romance in her relationship with Brandon had disappeared almost immediately after the wedding. He was completely absorbed in his work in the workshop. Having a wife was just another item on the checklist that he wanted to tick off in life. And Maya, in her love and joy, naively settled into the role of a homemaker, taking care of the house alone. They rarely went out, despite living in a resort area, and when they did go out, Brandon tried not to spend much money and rushed to finish the outing as soon as possible. Maya never received lavish gifts, and flowers were only given on holidays, out of a sense of obligation. But the most hurtful thing was something else. Maya thought that all of this was normal, that everyone lived like this and no one complained. She, being carefree and positive by nature, tried to see only the good in her husband and their marriage. A seagull with a loud noise flew so low that Maya was blown by wind from its wings. "You know, you're right. I am going to start running again, eating right. Let's go for walks more often." "Well done, Maya." Casey winked at her with a smile. "That's right. Live for yourself and enjoy yourself. And don't think about anything bad." It was unusual, and to put it bluntly, expensive for Brandon to drive almost 140 kilometres back and forth every day. But everything paled when he thought of Vanessa. Surprisingly, she did not bring up the subject of his divorce from his wife, although she was obviously happy to spend evenings and nights together. Spending days together was rare, and it annoyed Brandon. He was ready to give up everything for a charming woman, but she did not feel the same way. Vanessa never mentioned moving to her, although Brandon slept there. He didn't like living in his parents' mansion. It was noisy, cramped, crowded. He couldn't sit in silence. While at Vanessa's was cosy, delicious, cool in every sense. One stuffy evening, Brandon was waiting for his mistress near her house. She had gone to court to defend a client. Finally, at the end of the street, the familiar headlights of Vanessa's white SUV showed up. Brandon immediately jumped out of the car. His gut demanded to resent the woman's long absence, but Brandon restrained himself. He greeted his beloved briefly and glanced at the time. It was almost 11. "I didn't know the courts were so late," the man remarked casually. "No, the trial was over at 6, but after I needed to talk it over with my client and do some paperwork," Vanessa said, taking her bag and an impressive folder of papers from the back seat. "Maybe you can make me a duplicate key, so I don't have to wait under the fence like this," Brandon suggested. Vanessa looked at him and chuckled. "You could have a great time in some bar nearby. I don't understand why you chose to wait for me right here." Brandon opened his mouth but didn't find anything to object. It was difficult to argue with a self-assured woman. In the house, Vanessa went to take a shower. Brandon was waiting for her. He wanted wildly to eat and to rest in the coolness of the heat of the day. While his mistress had a shower, he poked his nose into the refrigerator and the kitchen cabinets. There was plenty of fruit, vegetables, yogurts, but nothing he used to eat. Usually, on their evenings together, he brought food from the cafe with him, or Vanessa ordered it. "Are we having dinner?" he asked the woman as she stepped out of the shower, toweling her hair. Vanessa had no time to answer before the doorbell rang. On the doorstep stood a courier with a package from a restaurant. Late dinner passed hurriedly. At the end of it, the time had passed well past midnight. Vanessa got up from the table, kissed Brandon on the cheek and said, "I have to go to court tomorrow morning. I want to get some sleep before then." "But I missed you so much." Brandon gave Vanessa a meaningful look. But the woman yawned and then rubbed the man's cheek with her finger. "We can do whatever we want, honey, but then I'll oversleep tomorrow and lose a money client. I'll also get a fine for not showing up for the meeting. I wouldn't want to jeopardize my career over our whim." "But I really need you." Brandon intercepted her hand and pulled her to him. Vanessa shrugged, kissed him on the forehead, and slipped into her bedroom. After a minute she looked out and said, "By the way, clean the kitchen tomorrow, since I had taken care of our dinner. I don't like returning to a messy house. And the door, as you leave, slam it from the outside. It will close itself without a key." Brandon looked unhappily at the leftovers, the crumbs on the table, and the empty glasses and containers. Vanessa's commanding tone made him annoyed. The thing that had been madly beckoning to him before was now shadowed by irritation. He quickly wiped the table, cleaned the glasses, and threw away the remaining packaging. As he did so, he realized that he had never seen Vanessa clean or cook. However, Vanessa's house was always clean and uncluttered. There was simply no place for dust to settle. In the morning, Vanessa slipped out from under Brandon's arm and began her usual morning routine. The coffee smelled fragrant and steaming as she took the mug. But something was off, not like it usually was. Vanessa looked at the table and noticed drops of olive oil from yesterday's salads, a peach pit in the corner, and poorly washed glasses with juice stains in the sink. The woman silently reflected on their last dinner as she sipped coffee from a mug. Then she turned on the faucet, carefully washed the mug and saucer, wiped them clean and put them away. In the evening, the sea was beautiful and crowded. People from the beaches flocked to the nearest cafes and strolled along the alleys and streets, searching for treats and entertainment. Maya and Casey went for an evening promenade too. "Well, have you already realized the benefits of a free life?" Casey asked, linking her arm with her friend's as she enthusiastically devoured an ice cream. "I guess I have," Maya nodded. She wasn't lying. With each day that passed without Brandon, Maya's mood and sense of self gradually shifted. From a lonely and sad woman, she gradually transformed into a girl with her own opinions. "Yes, I can see it too," Casey chimed in. "You look fresher and more beautiful, like a painting. Speaking of paintings, look at this." She nudged Maya and pointed to a street painter. Sitting on a folding chair, the artist leisurely shaded something with a pencil in a notebook. On the nearby counter his works were displayed. They were different, in oil and pencil, and in some very intricate technique with foil, tinfoil and glitter. Passers-by would see strange animals, the sea, the faces of elves, and peaceful streets of seaside towns in his paintings. "What can I do for you?" the artist asked, tearing his eyes away from his notebook and noticing the interested women. "We're betting whether you can draw a portrait of my friend," Casey blurted out. Maya stared at Casey, shocked. Her audacity could have embarrassed even a matronly criminal or the director of a plant. "I wonder what you're betting on?" the artist inquired. "If you can't do it, you'll give us any painting of yours we want." Casey became even more daring. "And if I can do it?" The interested man joined the game. "Then we'll pay you double the rate," the woman replied. "Well, that's a very tempting offer," the artist exclaimed, carefully taking another folding chair from the rack and gesturing for Maya to sit down. Red as a tomato, Maya sat down in front of the man, unsure of what to do with her arms and legs. "You can sit however you like. The main thing is not to turn your face away from the light," the artist said softly. He flipped a page in his notebook, sharpened his pencil, and began sketching. The artist's hand made quick, precise strokes, occasionally smudging the lead with his blackened fingers. His brown eyes captured the angles of Maya's jaw, the curve of her eyebrows and the shape of her nose. Maya too stole glances at the artist. He was tall with prominent cheekbones, dark hair, and a remarkably expressive look with refined features. He had a slightly unkempt appearance, forgivable for a creative person. His gaze seemed to penetrate Maya while also lulling her. The movements on the sheet became calmer and smoother. Finally, the artist put a small signature in the corner and turned the notebook over to the women. Maya gazed at the girl portrayed on a sheet of paper. The artist had captured every detail of her face. The expression, the sparkle in her eyes, the modest smile, and even the shadows in her dimples. Casey applauded in admiration. "Bravo! Bravo to the master!" she exclaimed. "Here, as agreed." Casey handed 2 bills to the master. "You did a brilliant job." But to their surprise, the artist refused to accept the promised reward. Instead, he carefully tore the portrait sheet out of his notebook and offered it to Maya. "I would like to change the terms," mumbled the master, looking at her. "I'll give you the portrait for free, but in return, you'll have dinner with me." Maya was taken aback. It was unexpected and pleasant. A shiver ran down her spine. She accepted the sheet and nodded, looking into the artist's eyes. "I'll be waiting for you tomorrow at this restaurant, 7 o'clock, he said, smiling and handing her the portrait. "And what's your name?" Maya asked as a farewell. "Jarrett," he replied in farewell. "I hope to know your name tomorrow." The girlfriends continued their walk. Excitedly, Casey chatted about getting ready for the date, offering advice on what to order and which perfume to choose. Maya heard her, but her mind was elsewhere. She was stunned, delighted, surprised, and a little afraid all at once. Nothing like this had ever happened in her life before. Maya could hardly believe what had just transpired. Someone was interested in her, but suddenly doubts occurred in her mind. Maya stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. "I can't meet him," she said, suppressing an inner impulse. "Are you crazy?" Casey rolled her eyes. "That's exactly what you need." "I'm still a married woman. I shouldn't do this to Brandon," Maya exclaimed, clasping her hands together. Casey squinted at her intently. "Honey, throw Brandon in the trash. He didn't have a guilty conscience when he left, did he? You're a free woman, and free women have complete freedom of action." But it's wrong. Maya desperately searched for reasons not to do something she desperately wanted to do. "Do you really think that going out to dinner with a handsome, charming, charismatic man is wrong?" Casey replied, looking at her very seriously. Maya sighed. "All right," Maya finally gave in. "I'll go." "Of course you will," Casey laughed. "I remember it's been a long time since you've had a new dress in your closet." Maya realized that she couldn't resist. In the battle between conscience and desire, desire came out on top. Work on Vanessa's order was progressing slower than she would have liked. Less than half of it was finished, as the chosen fence required intricate forging and detailing. Brandon, lacking his father's skill, struggled with the order. However, asking his father for help would be beneath Brandon's dignity, so he continued to make the order with profanity, mistakes, and spoiled material. As for Vanessa, she was too busy to think about her affair with Brandon. Her client's case was in full swing. Finally, on Saturday, Brandon and Vanessa had a day off together. Vanessa lazily stretched in bed, then put on a robe and went out to the kitchen to make coffee. The sound of the shower echoed from the bathroom. Brandon had woken up a little earlier than she had. In the living room, Vanessa noticed a plate of spaghetti carbonara. She had hastily made them the day before, and she and Brandon had enjoyed them while watching a show in the evening. Vanessa remembered putting away her plate and glass. She also asked Brandon to clean up after himself, but now the plate was hidden on the bottom shelf of the coffee table. Vanessa squinted and stepped closer. She picked up the plate and was horrified to find that it had been standing on the important papers inside the table, and now they were ruined with a greasy stain. "What are we going to have for breakfast?" Rubbing his head with a towel, Brandon looked out of the bathroom door. Vanessa scrutinized the ruined document, already estimating how much time and nerves it would take to get it again. "Will a dirty plate and a greasy tabletop suit you for breakfast?" asked Vanessa, running her finger across the surface of the table. "I don't get it," Brandon stammered, puzzled at the door. Yesterday's languid evening and gentle woman were too much of a contrast to this morning. "You probably didn't understand the cleaning request yesterday either, did you?" said Vanessa, still standing with her back to him. And then Brandon's nature broke through his crush and admiration for his mistress. It was hammered into Brandon's mind too firmly by his mother's hands. "I'm not obligated to do this," replied the man. "Washing the dishes and clearing the table is a woman's job." Vanessa finally turned to face him. Only then did Brandon notice the ruined document in her hand. "So, you're not obligated." "Okay." The woman stretched out. "Then what falls on your fragile shoulders, if you can't even carry a dirty plate to the kitchen and rinse it under the faucet?" Brandon realized that his wife never allowed such words. Fighting with her was boring. "I make money," he replied defiantly. Vanessa came closer and in a still calm voice clarified, "But I earn the money too, and I think even more than you do. Now the question is, why do I need a man who can safely be called useless to me?" "Maybe I'll just fix everything and we'll forget this conversation," Brandon squeezed out with an effort. "You know, Brandon, I can't stand people who can't be relied on," Vanessa replied. "It's a pity that it's impossible to make a contract for dishwashing with an indemnity for damaged property." Saying this, Vanessa pulled a folder out of the shelf, slipped a greasy sheet of paper into it, and then began to make a phone call. The woman actually paid no attention to her lover, who was frozen in the middle of the living room. "Get ready, I need to go on business," Vanessa threw to him briefly after 10 minutes. "You said you didn't have plans for today," Brandon said, not even realizing yet how he had gotten himself into trouble. "Thanks to you, I've gotten them." Vanessa froze in the doorway with her car keys, showing that she didn't intend to wait long. Brandon hastily dressed, picking up his backpack. Already sitting in his car, he watched as his mistress drove away. Brandon guessed that something bad had happened, but hoped that in the evening everything would be the same. "Maya, what a grandmother's outfit you're wearing." Casey was indignant, looking at her friend. "You'll think you're a crazy cat lady. Take it off at once." Maya obediently began to pull off her flowered t-shirt and black pants. "All right, couturier," said Maya with a smile. "What do you suggest I should dress up in?" "Well, certainly not what you usually wear," Casey grumbled. "The last time I went on a date was 5 years ago," Maya said, "and I have absolutely no idea what people wear now." "Stop complaining, Grandma Maya," Casey answered, laughing. "Do you think much has changed in 5 years? Standards and preferences are still the same. Skirts, blouses, dresses." Maya couldn't stand it and made a face, mimicking her friend. She was nervous and worried, but at the same time, she really wanted to see Jarrett again. "What about your white sundress with the inserts on the back?" Casey suddenly exclaimed. "The one I took a picture of you in on the shore. Put it on." "What?" "Well, but my back will be open," Maya protested. "No, I'll look silly." "On the contrary, my dear. In your worn-out t-shirts, you look like a turkey in socks," chuckled Casey, rushing to rummage through the closet. Maya obediently waited. Soon Casey pulled out a nicely ironed sundress and handed it to her friend. Maya hesitantly entered the room wearing the sundress. "Well, there you go. Quite a transformation," Casey exclaimed, even jumping up from the sofa where she had been sitting. "You're very beautiful and feminine in it, and you won't get too hot." Maya looked at herself uncertainly in the mirror. A smiling red-haired woman in an ankle-length white linen sundress stared back at her. The outfit accentuated her waist nicely. "I know what else you need," Casey said, raising a finger before scurrying out the door. Living in a neighbouring house, Casey soon returned with a small straw shoulder bag and sandals in the same style. The overall image was minimalistic, modest and pure. Maya didn't immediately recognize Jarrett. His paint-stained shirt and dishevelled hair were gone. He was wearing a simple white cotton t-shirt and white pants. "I see that we're both in white. How interesting," Jarrett remarked once they were seated. "I love that colour." Maya discreetly continued to gaze at the artist. "Why?" "White colour is associated with beginnings for me. When I pick up a blank canvas or a sheet of paper, those thoughts usually come to mind. White is impassive and pure," Jarrett explained. "May I know your name?" Maya introduced herself. Suddenly she stopped feeling shy and timid. She no longer fidgeted with her skirt or watched her watch. A sense of calm, comfort, and relaxation washed over her, despite the music and the other patrons in the restaurant. These feelings emanated from Jarrett. Maya involuntarily compared her perceptions of Brandon and Jarrett. Brandon was nervous, irritable, and somewhat lost in his thoughts. Jarrett exuded a calm and confident demeanour. Their conversation flowed as if they had known each other for years, but hadn't seen each other in a long time. Jarrett turned out to be a brilliant conversationalist. He lived in the capital, but every summer he moved to the south and rented a picturesque attic from a friend at a nominal fee. It served as his cosy and creative studio, filled with professional chaos. The artist listened attentively to Maya's stories about tutoring. With a smile, he asked why she didn't tan at all, living at the seaside. The girl felt embarrassed and honestly confessed everything that had happened a few weeks ago. Jarrett listened intently and then spoke. "I don't want to be intrusive. If you're still in love with your husband, or tormented by your conscience, we can stop at our today's meeting." No, Maya involuntarily interrupted him. "I would like to meet you again. You seem nice and understanding," she blurted out, not quite understanding why. "I like you too," Jarrett replied with a slight smile, winking at her and gently touching her hand. "I decided to invite you to dinner the moment you approached me with your friend in the alley." "And I probably would agree right then." Maya smiled back and brushed Jarrett's little finger with her thumb. "Shall we escape from here?" he whispered, leaning closer to her. "I'd love to," the girl agreed. Jarrett quickly paid for their dinner and then slipped away from the noisy establishment. They went through the alley first and then through narrow yards until they reached the beach. Maya took off her sandals and happily walked barefoot on the warm sand. They strolled along the shoreline, gradually moving away from the bustling alley. The sea was almost completely calm, with small waves barely touching the sand. As the lights on the promenade dimmed, the lilac and green sparkles in the water became visible. "The bioluminescent glow is mesmerizing, isn't it?" Jarrett said, sitting down and scooping some water into his palm. It slipped through his fingers, sparkling like liquid fire. "Yes, I've never seen this phenomenon, although I've lived by the sea since I was 15, Maya said, looking at the small lights with fascination. "Have you ever seen how the water turns pink at dawn?" Jarrett asked, looking at her. Maya shook her head, feeling like a newcomer tourist who was just getting acquainted with the coast and all its secrets. "Let's wait until dawn, and you'll see," the artist suggested. "Here? I'll probably fall asleep." Maya looked around uncertainly. "Why here?" Jarrett stood up, shaking the water off his hand. "From the windows of my attic, you can see the dawn in all its colours. If you don't mind coming." Maya opened her mouth to refuse, but something stopped her. Morality, conscience, and shame were mixed into a seething mess, but through them something shone, something calm, good and inspiring, infinite trust and faith in miracles. "I don't mind," Maya said, extending her hand to Jarrett, and they walked along the water again. Brandon spent the day after the strange conversation in the workshop. Vanessa didn't answer his calls. She read his messages, but didn't respond to them either. In the evening, feeling uncertain and with no clear answers, Brandon went to his mistress's house. He waited until midnight for her to talk, but ended up falling asleep in the car. In the morning, a dishevelled Brandon woke up, squinted against the sunlight. He saw that Vanessa's car was not in the front of the yard, but then he noticed that the curtains on the windows had been moved. Filled with a sudden hunch, Brandon jumped out of the car and ran to the front door. He rang the bell several times. After about 10 minutes, he heard barely perceptible footsteps. "Why aren't you picking up the phone? I thought something had happened to you," he exclaimed as soon as Vanessa slightly opened the door without removing the chain. "Dear, let me in. What's going on?" "First, good morning," Vanessa greeted him in her cold voice. "Secondly, I've been busy." "Let's have a normal conversation. Let me in." Brandon was indignant once again. "Brandon, go home. Stop bothering me or I'll call the police," Vanessa informed him indifferently. "You can come for your things tonight when I've had some sleep and can spare a couple of minutes for you." "What? What do you mean?" Brandon squinted at the girl through the gap between the door and the wall. "You're not deaf, are you? That's good. Now, would you be so kind as to disappear? I need to get some sleep." Vanessa slammed the door right in his face. Shocked and unable to comprehend, Brandon stood on the porch. He started texting to her, then erased it, then wrote again, then spat, kicked the car tire, got behind the wheel, and started so fast that pebbles flew from under the wheels as he drove away. Meanwhile, Maya was sitting on the giant sofa in Casey's apartment. "He must have thought I was an easygoing woman," sighed Maya, "and he won't call again." Maya, who was busy with trimming dry leaves from her many houseplants, tried to encourage her friend. "You had a great time, though. A night with a man like that is worth dealing with your conscience." "I wish I could silence my conscience," Maya muttered, while at the same time she was lost in a languid reminiscence. 2 days ago, she had spent the night with Jarrett in his studio and saw the promised pink sunrise. It was like something out of the best melodramas. He had wrapped her in a blanket and brought her coffee, and then they sat on the balcony on the shaggy rug, hugging and admiring the rising sun. "Oh," snorted Casey, "Brandon's conscience probably doesn't bother him at all. By the way, are you thinking of filing for divorce?" "I don't know." Maya hesitated. "What do you mean you don't know?" Casey flicked her scissors indignantly. "Start building a life without him. And let him figure things out on his own." Maya rubbed the tassel of the plaid in her hands. Her friend was right. She didn't have any clear reasons to stay married, but taking the first step towards legal freedom was scary. Suddenly, her phone jingled with a new message. "He's inviting me to his exhibition at the gallery tomorrow," she exclaimed joyfully. "I told you. A sundress works wonders," laughed Casey. The next day, Jarrett met her at the gallery, smiled and kissed her on the cheek. The gallery was crowded. Tourists, seeking relief from the heat and thirsting for cultural entertainment, admired the artist's artwork. "You never told me you were organizing an exhibition," Maya said, scanning the room with its white walls and large windows. "And you never mentioned that you liked sunrises," Jarrett whispered in her ear. "Come, let me show you my best work." He took her hand, and they walked to the deepest part of the exhibit. There was a large oil painting of a girl barely covered by a sheet. The sun's rays played on her skin, and her hair cascaded over her shoulder in beautiful curls. Maya stared at the details, marveling at the artwork, and suddenly it struck her. "Don't tell me it's me," she said, turning to Jarrett, who was standing behind her with a gentle smile. "I spent the whole day drawing it after you left. I barely ate. My paintbrush was constantly in my hand. I haven't had such an inspiration in a long time. You inspired this painting. I just transferred it to paper, and yesterday I decided to include it in the exhibition after all." Maya blinked in embarrassment, feeling a mix of embarrassment, admiration, and a pleasant thrill. "I would really like you to come with me to the capital for my second exhibition in 2 weeks," Jarrett said, holding her hand. "And also, I would like to speak about us as a couple." I need to think about everything," the woman replied, amazed by Jarrett's words. "I understand, and I won't rush you. Let's just enjoy today, okay?" Jarrett put an affectionate arm around her shoulders. Maya looked back at the painting. "I agree." Maya hugged Jarrett back and kissed his cheek. That night, Brandon didn't go to Vanessa's to collect his things. He was angry and didn't want to admit that the reason for their breakup was a dirty plate. What's wrong with that? Cleaning and washing dishes is a woman's job. That's how it's been done since ancient times. The man provides, and the woman takes care of the household. After a few days of waiting and calming down, Brandon decided to visit his mistress. He hoped for another attempt at a conversation. The man drove to Vanessa's house, called her, but got her answering machine, just like a few days before. The house windows were dark. Brandon decided to wait a little, and soon a familiar white SUV pulled into the parking lot in front of the house. Brandon hurried out of the car to catch Vanessa, wanting to talk to her without any formalities. But to his surprise, an unfamiliar man in a shirt and suit stepped out of the car. A few seconds later, Vanessa appeared herself. She looked slightly surprised at her worthless lover. Then she nodded at her companion and then approached Brandon leisurely. "Hi, your things are on the doorstep, in case you couldn't find them," she said dryly. "Vanessa, can we have a normal conversation?" Brandon persisted. "Who is this guy?" "I don't want to discuss anything with you. Everything is clear to me without additional conversations," the woman replied. "And this is my client. We won a very important case, and we were going to celebrate." Brandon felt his anger boiling inside. "You choose this dandy over me," he said, gesturing dramatically. Vanessa rolled her eyes tiredly, then let out a sigh. She approached Brandon and adjusted the collar of his polo shirt. "Brandon, you think too highly of yourself. I didn't ask you to leave your wife, which you happily announced. I was just bored. I was looking for a nice evening's entertainment, and you stuck to me like a leaf. And you're showing your temper in a situation that's totally unfavourable to you. Do you think I'm going to put up with that? Trust me, it's better for you to take your few things that have been left at my place and go away." Brandon got a lump in his throat and a sickening stabbing in his chest. "You can't throw me out like that." "I already kicked you out a couple of days ago," Vanessa replied indifferently. "And by the way, the completed order I'm waiting for will arrive in 14 days, according to the terms of the contract, or you will finish it for free." "What?" Brandon stared at her. "You should have read the terms and conditions, Kitty." Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "Otherwise, I'll sue you. I'd hate to waste my time on this, of course, but terms are terms." She turned away, waving her hand. The conversation was over. Brendan was left alone in the parking lot. He was utterly trampled and finally awake. He clenched his fist and got into the car, deciding not to take his things, to avoid humiliating himself even further. Maya paced back and forth through the room of her apartment. Inside, conflicting feelings of duty, conscience, public opinion, and new feelings for another person battled. Casey also persuaded her to maintain a relationship with Jarrett. "Agree, little fool. You have a man who is educated, creative, handsome, and not poor. He fell in love with you at first sight, and you're still thinking." "I know, Casey," Maya sighed, "but I am really afraid." She didn't have an opportunity to continue because there was a knock on the apartment door. She opened the door and stunned. "Brandon?" Maya stepped back instinctively. "What are you doing here?" "I want to make up," Brandon declared. "Let's talk, okay? May I come in?" He was about to cross the threshold when Maya blocked his path. The man looked perplexed at his ex-wife. "What are you doing, Maya?" There was so much disregard for her in this phrase that Maya felt disgusted. The puzzle pieces had come together. "This is my apartment, Brandon," Maya reminded him. "If you want to talk, let's talk in the park, for example." "Okay," Brandon agreed sourly. Maya closed the door and exhaled, leaning back against its surface. 5 minutes later, she was outside. Brandon was sitting on a bench in the shade of fragrant bushes in front of the apartment building and nervously tapping on the wooden bars of the seat. I'm listening, Brandon, Maya said, taking a seat next to him. Outwardly, Maya appeared calm, but inside everything was boiling. I left her, and I want us to be together again. Forgive me. Brandon spoke with the same self-confident voice. And you think I'm going to take you back with open arms? Maya folded her arms across her chest. Well, I've apologized. Brandon didn't understand what else she wanted from him. In a week, you might want to have another woman and go back to her, Maya continued. No, thank you. I'm not interested in a relationship with you anymore. Maya, trust me, I'm not going to find anyone else, said Brandon. What if I say yes? I will have the same greyness of everyday life, arguments over women's and non-women's work, and other forms of neglect from him, Maya said. Everyone lives like that. Brandon shrugged his shoulders. My parents, other families, and no one complains. Don't speak for everyone, Maya interrupted him. Maya, please forgive me. I did a stupid thing. What else do you want? Brandon looked at her, anguished and a little irritated. His face showed that he expected the situation to be resolved more easily and quickly. I don't need anything from you any more except divorce, Maya said firmly. I realized that life could be different. What could be different? Brandon was wary. Everything. From attitude to me, to dishwashing. I don't want to go back to the swamp you prepared for me. But we're still married. Hey! A stunned Brandon jumped up from the bench. Where are you going? Forward, to a happy life. Maya spoke briefly and confidently walked away. It was so easy to do what had seemed impossible a month ago. September on the coast was still the tourist season, and there were fewer people and quieter beaches. The sun had warmed, the sea sparkled with silver, and the greenery was riotous. When you get there, text me immediately, Casey reminded her friend for the third time. I will text, call, and send pictures, Maya joked. You're so worried, as if you were the one leaving. I have an aerophobia, even when I'm the one on the ground, and the people close to me are in the sky. Casey nervously shook her head. I don't trust those flying things. And do you trust me? Jarrett appeared behind Maya's back, looking at Casey with a questioning gaze. Casey grinned at him, assessing him from head to toe, and then spoke. Considering how Maya started shining with you, yes, I trust you. The announcement for boarding the flight to the capital echoed through the airport. Maya and Jarrett hurriedly made their way towards the gate. The engines roared as the aircraft lifted off the ground, carrying its passengers through the air. Maya was captivated by the view outside the window, admiring the beautiful coastline from a bird's-eye perspective. I think I've become a fan of flying, Maya exclaimed with enthusiasm. I'm glad to be by your side during such an important moment. Jarrett laughed and held her hand. Maya leaned back in her seat as the plane ascended above the clouds and the earth disappeared. The past week had been quite eventful for her. Firstly, she changed the lock on her front door. Brandon couldn't accept no for an answer and had attempted to enter her home at night with his key. He persisted, knocking, pleading and swearing for a long time, but eventually left in the morning. Secondly, she filed for divorce. And thirdly, Maya accepted Jarrett's offer to visit his exhibition in the capital. Although he was glad, he noticed a slight hesitation in her eyes. Jarrett tightly embraced her and said, Thank you, sweetheart, that you trusted me. I will do everything to make you happy with me. Maya hugged Jarrett tightly. She was already happy. She had the best man next to her, and an interesting life ahead of her. Ruth was born in a small town as the eldest child in the family. Her younger sister Leela was born 3 years later. 7 years after that, their parents divorced. Sarah's husband was caught cheating publicly, and such news spread across the town swiftly. When Sarah was informed about it by a well-wisher, she turned pale, but said nothing and went home. That same evening, the woman brought the girls to spend the night with their grandfather, Sarah's father, while she stayed home, waiting for her husband to return from work. As soon as Derek crossed the threshold, he noticed 2 suitcases packed with his belongings and sighed in resignation. "They told you already, huh?" His wife nodded calmly. "Yes, Derek." He shrugged. "I don't know what to say. The devil's got me confused." The woman sighed. "You, Derek, got confused a few months ago. I've noticed the long hair on your clothes, the smell of female perfume, and the change in your attitude towards me. I convinced myself that things would improve, that all men do this, and that I should be patient for the girl's sake. I turned a blind eye for as long as I could." "So why don't we wait it out, Sarah?" There was hope in the man's voice. The woman laughed nervously. "After the way you embarrassed me all over town, I can't even look at you right now." Derek swallowed. "What about our daughters? Will you even let me see them?" "Sure, you can see Ruth and Leela as much as you want. Now, go away. I can't stand to see you any more." Derek sighed, but did not argue or persuade. He knew his wife too well. If she had made up her mind about something, there was no changing it. So he picked up his suitcase and left without saying goodbye. Sarah closed the door behind him, stood there for a few seconds, then exhaled deeply and went into her bedroom. She switched on the iron, laid out a blouse on the ironing board and started ironing. After 2 precise movements, her hands trembled. She put the iron aside, slid down the wall, and quietly sobbed. The woman came to her father's the next morning. She looked pale with dark circles under her eyes, and a small new wrinkle had appeared between her eyebrows. "Girls, I need to talk to you," she said, and then explained to the girls that their father would no longer be living with them. Adjusting to life without their father was challenging. The flat seemed emptier, missing his cheerful morning singing from the bathroom. No one else pretended to be a horse for them and Leela to ride on. Even the coat rack seemed emptier without his jacket. Derek visited his daughters, but he seemed different. The man attempted to engage with them as before, but his efforts appeared insincere, tinged with guilt. These meetings left the girls not with joy, but with a vague anxiety and a sense of impropriety. And then one day, returning home from school, Ruth saw a truck full of boxes, cabinets, chairs and other items in their yard. Several men were unloading the belongings and taking them into her apartment building. The girls followed them inside and up to her floor. The door to the apartment across was wide open, and the items were being moved in there. "Do we have new neighbours? Have you seen them?" Ruth asked her mother, who was cooking in the kitchen, while Leela drew at the table. "Yes, I've seen," replied the woman without turning around. "It seems a young woman and a boy about your age are moving in. We should meet them." But the new neighbours turned out to be quicker in meeting with neighbours. After lunch, the doorbell rang. Sarah went to open it. "We have a very nice neighbour," the mother announced, smiling when she returned to the kitchen. "We're having dinner with them tonight." "Yay, guests!" Leela cheered. Ruth frowned but said nothing. She didn't want strangers in their house, especially boys. She even considered asking for permission to visit her grandfather, but she quickly dismissed the thought. Her mum would certainly not allow it. "Fine," Ruth decided. "I'll spend some time with this boy, then I'll go to my room." After work, Sarah usually felt tired and tried to rest in the evening. She had to check pupils' workbooks and write plans for the next lessons. However, today was different. Right after lunch, she finished her teacher's work and began cleaning, involving her daughters. Once they finished cleaning, the woman started cooking. "Is that a raspberry pie with cream cheese cream?" Ruth asked in surprise, noting that her mother usually prepared it only for holidays. Sarah chuckled. "I think tonight will be a special night for us." Finally, the doorbell rang. An eager Ruth rushed to open it. "Peace be upon this house and its hospitable owners," a young woman greeted from the doorstep. It took Ruth a few moments to understand why her mother was so excited. Their new neighbour resembled a pagan goddess of spring and sunshine. She was tall and slender, with long, slight red, slightly curly hair. Her large, bright green eyes twinkled with a smile when she gazed at Ruth. The woman's attire was also unusual. She wore a long, multicoloured dress. Her arms were adorned with numerous bracelets made of wooden beads, metal chains, and multicoloured threads that matched her dress. "My name is Gail," the woman said, her smile compelling Ruth to reciprocate, "and this is my son Connor." Only now did Ruth notice the boy standing behind her. He seemed to be about her age, with hair and eyes reminiscent of his mother's, and was dressed in a plain black t-shirt and blue jeans. He looked at Ruth with a slightly superior smile, as if he was aware of the effect his mother usually had on people. However, he did not come across as arrogant or smug. Ruth suddenly thought that they could become friends. "Come on in," Ruth invited them. Gail smiled and stepped into the flat. "Mum's in the kitchen," informed Ruth. "I'll see you out." Sarah cheerfully greeted her guest. It seemed she had already decided they would be friends. Indeed, anyone would want to befriend the beautiful, vibrant and cheerful Gail. She gave the impression of carrying a celebration in her pocket, ready to share it and spread joy. Such people are never dull or uninteresting. While the mothers wrapped up dinner preparations, Ruth and Connor retreated to the living room. Leela was already there, engrossed in playing with her dolls. She eyed the new boy with curiosity, but remained silent. Ruth realized that, as the eldest, it was her responsibility to extend hospitality and entertain their guest. "Will you go to our school?" "Yes, and we can go to school together, if you don't mind." Ruth shrugged, pretending not to care. "What do you like to do in your spare time, after school, for example?" "I don't know," she answered, a little confused. "Sometimes I watch TV. I can read a book or something." The boy nodded. "Books are great. I really enjoy reading too." "And what about you?" Ruth asked. But he made her feel self-conscious because she hadn't previously considered that she should be doing something else except her homework. "I collect Lego," replied Connor. Ruth scoffed and said proudly, "Building sets are for kids." Connor smiled. "Aren't we kids?" She felt embarrassed again. Technically he was right, but none of her friends had ever agreed with that sentiment so easily before. They refused to admit that they were still children. Instead, they were always trying to prove to each other that they were already grown up. At that moment, their mother emerged from the kitchen. She carried a platter laden with a salad and lasagna that Gail had prepared. "Children, come to the table," Sarah said. Once everyone was seated, Gail poured white wine into 2 glasses. Connor, Ruth and Leela filled identical glasses with juice. The red-haired guest stood up, scanned the room and smiled. "My and my son's lives have recently changed," she began. "I'm delighted about it. In my opinion, change is always for the better. Let's raise our glasses to change." "To change," Sarah echoed enthusiastically. Ruth and Leela looked at their mother in surprise. They had grown used to her quiet, calm, stern and frowning demeanour over the past year, but now, within a few hours, she seemed rejuvenated and full of life. Could it be the influence of their new neighbour? Ruth glanced at Gail with respect and gratitude. The woman somehow caught her gaze, smiled and winked slyly. Ruth blushed and quickly looked at Connor, who was eating nonchalantly. Well, Ruth thought to herself, let's see if all this change really is for the best. First time, Ruth resisted becoming friends with Connor. She felt this way because, firstly, Connor was a boy, and she believed boys were inherently troublesome, disagreeable and self-absorbed. Secondly, Ruth was determined to be brave, strong, independent and self-reliant. She was hesitant to trust a newcomer about whom she knew nothing. She tried everything possible to make Connor understand that they should not be friends. However, any verbal attacks aimed at him seemed to bounce off like a rubber ball hitting a wall. They walked to school together, studied in the same class, and even shared a desk for some lessons. Frankly speaking, few classmates dared to willingly sit with the prickly Ruth, but Connor didn't seem to notice her coldness. Gradually, Ruth began to soften, and before she knew it, they had become friends. She didn't immediately realize how much happier and easier her life had become with the arrival of the red-haired newcomers, Connor and his mother. They seemed to bring with them a sense of joy that had been missing from her home since her parents' divorce. As for Gail, she quickly became friends with Sarah, much faster than her son with Ruth. The women began spending a lot of time together. Sarah was surprised to find that happiness was possible outside of a relationship. "I really sympathize with you," Gail said after Sarah had shared her life story with her. "How are you feeling now?" Sarah shrugged. "You know, it's been awful, especially in our small town, when everyone knows each other. It feels like everyone is looking at me when I walk down the street." Gail frowned. "Does that bother you?" "Of course," Sarah replied. "It's difficult to live normally and pretend not to notice the sideways glances and whispers." Gail smiled. "Ultimately, it's your choice, isn't it? To pay attention to people or not. I don't fit the standard look, and I get many stares. Some even dare to share their invaluable opinion about how I should look." Both women laughed. "I always talk about myself," Sarah said, "and I've never once asked about you. That's quite selfish of me." "Oh," Gail shook her head. "Please don't speak like that. Taking care of yourself or paying attention to yourself isn't a bad thing. And if you really want to hear my story, then listen to it. I've always had a family of women," Gail began with a smile. "It's like the stories about witches. I don't know, all the women in my family, in every generation, have somehow always lived alone. My grandmother raised my mum alone. I've never seen my grandfather. But my grandmother never seemed to care that she lived without a husband. She didn't marry my grandfather either, despite the strong disapproval back then. But my grandmother didn't care." "What about your mother?" "It's similar. I was raised by her and my grandmother, but I saw my father occasionally. He sent me gifts on my birthday, Christmas, and visited about once a year. He lived far away. My mum met him when she was a student. She went on a summer internship and stayed there part-time for the rest of the summer. Then she found out she was pregnant." Gail smiled. "My father told me he'd proposed to her. He was a few years older, already working, and ready to bring her into his family. His parents would help with the baby, but she didn't agree." "Didn't she love him?" Gail shrugged uncertainly. "She says she was afraid of being alone, far from her family, with a baby and living with a man she'd only known for a couple of months, and she was unsure of how his parents would treat her. Here she had a home, studying, plans. She was sure that Grandma would be supportive. She came home before the school year started and told her she was pregnant." "And what about your grandma?" "She said something like, 'Well, it's your time.' My mum studied until the last month of her pregnancy, then she took a sabbatical. I was born. She stayed home for a year and then went back to her study. Grandma helped her with me." "Did your father try to convince your mum to marry him?" Sarah asked. "Yes, many times. Even when I was a little girl, I often heard these conversations. He remembered her and loved her for many years. I think at one point he was even ready to move in with us. But my mum wouldn't agree, and then when I was about 10 years old, I found out he got married. Now he has 3 children and seems happy. We still communicate well." "And your mother didn't marry, did she?" "Yes, neither did my grandmother. She starts dating someone from time to time, but it doesn't last long. Mum says she's like a cat who walks on her own. By the way, my mother, grandmother and I are very much alike. You would have known that we are a family at first sight. They're not of this world either." Sarah was embarrassed. "I don't think you're weird." Gail shook her head reassuringly. "I don't see anything wrong with being weird. If what's natural to you seems strange to others, but doesn't hurt them in any way, what's wrong with that? But for a while I tried to be normal. When I entered the college, I moved away from my mum and granny. I purposely chose a different city and moved into a hostel there. I wanted to be like everyone else, a normal student. Except it's complicated. I was raised by two freedom-loving women who did whatever they wanted and allowed me to do the same. There, I met Connor's father at an exhibition of young artists. Are you a painter? Gail shrugged. No, I dabbled in a bit of everything back then, including embroidery and clay modelling. And now? I teach dance, yoga, and I'm a pretty good singer. I'll show you sometime. But we digress from Connor's dad. I came to this exhibition to support my friends, and out of curiosity, he was there with other businessmen, scouting for young talents to invest in, hoping their paintings would appreciate in value. John is a very wealthy and influential man, 15 years older than me. He took a liking to me instantly. He said my attire was unusual. Gail laughed. I tried not to stand out, but I couldn't shake off my ingrained taste. I wore a multicoloured skirt my grandmother made, paired with a plain white top. I even had dreadlocks then. It was the trend. Sarah laughed. Yeah, with that description, you didn't stand out at all. Gail waved her off. Everyone was like that there. Art folks, always peculiar. Things between John and me took off quickly. He was so clever, so intriguing, and most importantly, we understood each other perfectly. It was just wonderful. I thought I had met the man of my dreams, yet I didn't even tell my mum and grandmother about him. Why? Gail shrugged. I don't know. I was afraid their curse would affect me. I feared that if I told them, things would immediately fall apart between John and me. Then I found out I was pregnant. John was overjoyed. He had wanted kids for a long time and proposed to me right away. John offered to move in with him while the wedding preparations were going on. I agreed. That's when things started to change. Sarah, who had been hoping for a happy ending, even though she knew it was unlikely, sighed. What started to change? Gail smiled sadly. I realised that lifestyle wasn't for me. Even my belongings looked out of place in his large, expensive house. It was like uprooting a dandelion from the street, planting it in a flower pot, and placing it in a designer-renovated house. I was completely out of place. I realised I couldn't be myself. I couldn't attend a social event with John, with red dreadlocks and a skirt my grandmother sewed. I suddenly realised that even if I tried to fit into society, those attempts would fail. I'm like my mother and grandmother. I don't want to live in a gilded cage. I don't want to be taught which fork to use for prawns, or which wine to order with duck. Sarah sighed. And you left him? Gail nodded. For the first time in ages, her face didn't seem filled with sunlight. I talked to John. He persuaded me we could find an arrangement that would suit everyone. He said I could dress and behave however I wanted, furnish the house to my liking, and he wouldn't restrict me in any way. Why did you say no? Gail's smile became sadder. Because it was impossible. It's like asking a fish to live on land. You can water it or feed it, but it won't feel better on dry land. It's what John grew up with. His entire family, his friends, his job. If we continued living together, we'd have to fight them every day, defending me. I wouldn't wish that on him. The women fell silent for a while. Then Sarah asked, Do John and Connor keep in touch? Gail nodded. Yes, often. They have a good relationship. And do you regret it? No, Gail answered immediately without a second thought. Our paths crossed for a while, but they were never meant to come along. Besides, regretting the past means losing the present and the future. Sarah pondered her friend's words. It seems that you and your son did not accidentally appear in our lives at this time. Gail chuckled heartily. I believe there are no coincidences, she confessed. A couple of years passed. One day Ruth went to Connor's house after school as usual and caught him assembling another Lego set. That's impressive. Yeah, I like it too. Connor quietly agreed. It's very relaxing to assemble them. I can spend weeks on it. I feel a bit ashamed that I don't do anything, Ruth confessed. Oh, you shouldn't, Connor smiled. Have you ever had any hobbies? I used to enjoy photography, Ruth revealed. My grandfather had an old camera. It could only take a few dozen shots, which then had to be developed. Do you take photos now? No. Well, I've just remembered that, and I thought I might try. But now I would have suggested a digital camera to you. Ruth sighed. Do you realise how expensive those are? Sure, Mum and Dad could provide some money, but they won't buy such a pricey thing. Connor sat beside her on the bed. You could earn money for it. In summer we can get a part-time job together. Incredulous, Ruth looked at him. Well, we could try. What's the job? So they started working at a coffee shop. Connor could chat with anyone and taught Ruth to do the same. It was he who placed out a jar with a sign, "For a camera," on the counter. Why would you do that? Ruth felt embarrassed. What's the problem? Connor shrugged his shoulders. It's not like it's forced. If someone wants to, they'll leave a tip. And people did leave tips. Not much, but there were also very good days. What kind of camera? A customer once asked. He was a tall, handsome man in his 30s. Ruth was embarrassed, but Connor replied, My friend was a photographer, and now she needs a good camera to continue. The man hesitated. Do you have any sample work? Connor quickly took out some pictures from under the counter. The man examined them, returned them to Connor, and smiling, put a few notes in the jar. Ruth's eyes widened. The man winked at her and left. That's 200s, the girl gasped. Connor smiled. See, it's working. Where did you get my photos? Your grandfather gave me a few more. Ruth made a face. She was uncomfortable with the intrusion, but it was working. By the end of the summer, they had earned the money. Ruth wanted to split the tips, but Connor insisted. No, it's all yours. The jar says it's for a camera. But I only need half the money. I know, but you'll use all the money to buy something better. And honestly speaking, my father gives me enough for my needs. Ruth frowned. So you didn't have to work? Did you do it just for me? For the first time, Connor seemed embarrassed, but he had always been honest with her. Yes, I don't need the money, but I wanted the experience. Plus, I'll still have 3 months' salary. Money's always useful. All right. For some reason, the girl didn't push it further. She had a sudden thought that Connor took the job to spend more time with her. Ridiculous, the girl said to herself. Why would he do that? A week later, she picked up her camera, and after snapping her first picture, she realized this was her calling. She could now understand Connor, who spent hours in his room with his construction set. She was eager to explore this newfound hobby. For her birthday, she asked her mother for a book on photography, and she got a comprehensive one with detailing the basics of photography. Now I understand why good pictures are good and bad ones are bad, she enthusiastically told Connor. All these horizons, perspectives, contrasts, they're not just empty words anymore. I'm glad you found something you enjoy. I think you'll be great at it professionally. Ruth snorted. Oh, stop it. Why not? Submit your pictures to a contest. No way. I don't know anything yet. It took Connor a year to convince her. She didn't win, but her work was singled out by the jury as the best from a young photographer. This recognition propelled Ruth to delve deeper into photography. I love that you have a hobby, her mother told her, but you should also think about college. Your best friend is into his construction set, but he's also preparing for a finance degree. Ruth frowned. I don't know what I want yet, Mum, but okay, I'll think about it. The girl shared her concerns with Connor. What do you want to do? He asked. She shrugged. I would like to take pictures all my life, but my parents won't be happy with that. Are you sure you want to do what they tell you to do? Ruth sighed. Yes, I'm not ready to go against them. I won't give up photography either, but I need to study something more real. Connor thoughtfully ruffled his red hair. Where can you study without stress? What subjects do you find easy? Literature, you know that. Connor smiled. Maybe you should consider becoming a philologist. That's what they did. Connor pursued finance as he planned, while Ruth began studying philology, albeit without much enthusiasm. Photography remained her primary interest. She regularly submitted her work to competitions, receiving increasing recognition. For instance, a photograph of Grandpa and Leela playing chess won second place in a major competition, earning her a substantial cash prize. She also began taking part-time jobs doing wedding, Christmas, family photo shoots, maternity and newborn shoots, and various thematic ones, though she wasn't very fond of these. I can't shoot these the way they want, she admitted to Connor. People have preset expectations of what photos should look like. Connor laughed. What do you enjoy shooting? Ruth shrugged. Nature, abandoned buildings, random people. I know that, but I asked about your favourite shoots you do for money. Ruth was deep in thought. Perhaps personalised photo shoots? But only when the client wants something unique and trusts me. I've not had many of those. Maybe 2 people in all this time. She sighed and looked at her friend. But Connor, I can't turn down the work. It's decent money. Otherwise I'd have to ask my parents. You know, I'm afraid I'll get stuck in this job. Afraid I'll stop growing. Connor pondered for a moment. You know me, I'm practical. But if I were more romantic, I'd suggest you drop out of college, quit your part-time jobs, and focus on pure art. But I'm practical, so my advice is simple. Finish your degree, keep your part-time jobs, and make the most of them. Whenever possible, exercise your creativity. Ruth snorted again. That's great advice. Just be everywhere at one time. Excel here and there. I barely have time to date because of work and studies. I can't remember the last time I went to the cinema with a guy. Last Saturday with me. I mean a real date, Ruth smiled. I understand I'm not one of the worthy contenders for your heart, answered Connor. Ruth blushed slightly. Connor, stop it. You know what I meant. Back to the point. It seems like your option is the only right one, as I don't want to give up anything yet. That's what I figured. And surprisingly, Ruth managed everything. Got her diploma, which settled her moral debt to her parents. But she never worked a day in her speciality, because by then she was making good money as a photographer. Little by little, she started choosing her clients, working with those who trusted her, and got amazing results. For the first time in years, she was able to relax and devote herself entirely to the work she loved. Initially, her parents were skeptical, but she was supported by Connor, Gail, and her younger sister. Unexpectedly, her grandfather sided with her and spoke to Sarah, who, sighing, accepted Ruth's choice to pursue photography, not philology. Ruth also started sorting out her personal life. For years she had focused only on her studies and work. She even envied Connor. After their talk about her future, he started dating more frequently. The relationships were short-lived, but the number of girlfriends was surprising. Once, Sarah even mentioned to Gail, I never thought our Connor would turn out to be such a ladies' man. He always seems so calm and serious. I even thought he liked Ruth at one point, and now this sudden change? Gail shrugged her shoulders. I'm not pleased about it myself. I know there are people abundant in love. I've met such people. They sincerely fall in love with everyone they meet. But with my son it's different. It's as if he's using these girls to cover some pain. Maybe we should talk to him about it, Sarah suggested. He's too adult to take advice. Only time will help here. Connor is a clever boy. He'll realise he doesn't need this. Due to his numerous girlfriends, Connor spent less time with Ruth than before, which upset her. She tried to understand him. Sometimes he would bring some girls to their gatherings, but this only annoyed Ruth. All the girls were equally annoying to her. They were tall, slender, beautiful, but all equally empty and stupid. Then Ruth met Matt. They met at an exhibition where her works were displayed. It was opening day. Ruth was waiting for Connor, but he was late. She called him several times, but he didn't answer. Leela said she'd come tomorrow. Her parents were working. Her grandfather was unwell and stayed at home, so Ruth was alone at the exhibition. She looked at her colleagues' works. Some were not to her taste, others intrigued her. After touring the whole exhibition, she stopped at her favourite work. "Do you like it?" She suddenly heard a man's voice behind her. Ruth turned around. A tall, black-eyed guy was looking at her. He was dressed all in black, with black curly hair just touching his shoulders. Ruth immediately thought of romantic but slightly sad heroes. "I wish I could take a picture of him. A black overcoat in an autumn park. It seems fine," thought Ruth, and then said to the guy, "What about you?" "Very deep and tragic. Yes, the lonely figure of a girl in a dark park against the light of a lone lantern. Most of the picture is taken up by the night sky, where a huge firework is blossoming. She's alone watching it, like a festivity passing her by." Ruth nodded thoughtfully. "How beautifully you described it, as if you knew the photographer." He smiled. "Unfortunately, I don't know him or her, but I'd like to meet them." She extended her hand. "Ruth Saboliver." "What a meeting! Matt," the young man introduced himself, shaking her hand and pointing to the picture, asked, "Did I guess correctly?" Ruth smiled. "Not quite. It's not a silhouette of a girl. It's a dog. If you look closely, you'll see." And she didn't seem sad to me, rather amazed by the firework. It surprised me because animals are usually afraid of loud noises and bright lights, but this dog wasn't. Matt grinned. "How foolish I must have looked." "No, not really," Ruth admitted, "but it was funny." "In that case, I'm glad, because I've met you, a young, beautiful girl who happens to be a talented photographer." Ruth blushed and smiled. "Thank you. That's kind to say. Are you a photographer too?" Matt shook his head. "Unfortunately, no. I work as a model and an actor." "Wow, that's amazing. Could I have seen you somewhere?" "I don't think so. I'm just a rising star, about to ascend." Suddenly, Ruth mustered up the courage to ask, "Would you agree to be my model?" "If only you agree to have a cup of coffee with me." "Then I agree." 20 minutes later, they were already sitting in the cafe. Ruth saw several missed calls from Connor and one message on her phone. "Ruth, where are you? I'm here." She read it, but didn't reply. Matt seemed to her a very nice and interesting guy. Ruth suddenly felt how wonderful it was to be with a man who looked at her with such adoring eyes, offered compliments, held doors open, made jokes, and asked her out on a date. At their first meeting in the cafe, they agreed on a photo shoot. Everything went so smoothly that Ruth could hardly believe it. She had never worked with professional models before. Matt anticipated her every thought, suggested options. Ruth barely had time to capture the right angles, but she didn't want to stop him. "That was great," Ruth exclaimed when it was over. "You haven't checked anything yet," Matt chuckled. "I already know that," she responded. He suddenly sighed. "What's wrong?" Ruth asked. "I just realized that now I need to come up with another excuse to see you again." The girl blushed and looked down. "I can help you with such a problem. Say we could meet next time so I can show you the finished pictures." Matt pretended to consider this. "Well, I suppose that's a good excuse. Deal." A month later, she was roused from sleep by a call from Connor. "What do you want?" she asked groggily. "Oh, how sharp and unwelcoming," Connor retorted. Ruth sighed and sat up in bed. "I was still asleep." "Wow, it's already 10 in the morning. And what kept you up so late last night?" Ruth recalled the previous night a smile spreading across her face. "None of your business," she said. "You probably had a girlfriend too. Who's with you now? Polly? Molly? Dolly?" Connor disregarded her question. "Do you have a boyfriend?" "Yes, I do." "That's news. Why haven't you introduced me?" "We haven't been dating for long, and by the way, when? I haven't seen you in ages. You can't seem to find the time for me between your girlfriends." "Ruth, you know very well that I only have one friend, and that's you. The others are just flings." Ruth knew, and even smiled involuntarily, but asked sternly, "You didn't call me just to chat, did you? What do you want?" "I just missed you. I wanted to ask if we could meet." "That's a great idea. Why don't we make it a double date?" After a few seconds of heavy breathing into the receiver, Connor replied, "OK, let's do it." The double date was a peculiar experience for Ruth. On the surface everything seemed normal, but she could sense a tension in the air. Claire, Connor's girlfriend, was a stereotypical 19-year-old blonde with massive pink lips, wearing a short blue dress and high heels. Seeing her, Ruth breathed a sigh of relief. He won't be with her for long, Ruth thought. 3 weeks max. Connor appeared to act as usual, occasionally smiling, even joking, with his arm around his girlfriend. But Ruth knew him too well. All this time, he had been observing Matt in an analytical way, like an entomologist studying a new insect species. To Ruth, Matt was perfect. He looked handsome, joked, and made a good impression on Claire, speaking with her about his film shoots. Connor watched Matt, while Ruth watched Connor. At the end of the evening, Ruth found a moment to speak with her friend. "So, what's your opinion?" she inquired. "A narcissistic, pompous show-off, talking about himself all night. What a bore." Taken aback, Ruth retorted, "If he hadn't been talking, there would have been silence. You didn't say a word all evening. I've heard all his stories, so I kept quiet. Are you upset that Claire was so focused on him?" "Claire?" Connor seemed confused. "What does Claire have to do with it? Anyway," he conceded, "I don't need to lecture you. You'll figure it out in time." "Exactly," Ruth agreed curtly. "I'll figure it out by myself." "The main thing is for you to be happy," Connor suddenly said, with a hint of sadness and pain in his eyes. "Thank you," Ruth responded. "Thank you for allowing me to date whoever I want, even though I didn't ask. Good luck with Claire," she added. "Like you don't know me well," Connor replied with a sad grin. "Another 2 or 3 weeks at the most." "I know you well," thought Ruth, "but sometimes it's as if I don't understand your actions at all." 4 months later, Matt proposed. "Maybe we should start living together." Ruth agreed, and the next day she shared the news of her moving in with Matt with her mother and younger sister. "Finally," Leela responded. "I thought I'd get married before you." "We're just planning on moving in together for now," replied her older sister with a laugh. "I'm happy for you, daughter," said Sarah. "Do you love him?" "Yes," Ruth replied without hesitation, but for some reason Connor came to her mind at that moment. They had barely seen each other in these 4 months. All she knew was that he had broken up with Claire and was now dating someone else. 6 months later, Matt proposed. Naturally, Ruth said yes. She saw her best friend less and less. She even worried that Connor wouldn't attend her wedding, but he did, accompanied by his latest model girlfriend, whose name Ruth couldn't remember. Each time Ruth glanced at Connor, he was staring at her intensely. He spent the entire celebration sitting at the table, looking pale and tense. She herself couldn't relax either. Ruth attempted to focus on her husband, to hold his hand, to converse with him, but it was almost impossible. Matt was continuously approached by actors, TV presenters, producers. Then Grandpa approached her, just as the presenter announced another dance. "Ruth, may I?" He tilted his head and extended his hand, inviting her to dance. Ruth smiled. Of course. How can one reject such a handsome man? Grandfather chuckled. He led her gently and cautiously in the dance. You look very pale tonight, he voiced softly. I think the stylist overdid the makeup. Ruth tried to jest. Michael sighed. Do you remember when you were little? We made an agreement. Ruth smiled. Yes, to always tell each other the truth, she replied. Grandfather nodded. He didn't say anything else, but it was clear he was awaiting a response from his granddaughter. I'm scared, she finally admitted. How can I be certain if I've made the right choice? Maybe today I'm sure I love Matt, but what if in a year or 5 or 20 I realise I don't love him any more? What do I do then? How do I recover the lost years? How can I be sure I'm not making a mistake when I choose? Grandpa sighed thoughtfully and after a moment replied, The choice you make is always the right one at the time you make it. None of us can predict the future. We choose what seems best in the present. Currently, you've chosen Matt because he makes you happy. If that changes in the future, so will your choice. The important thing is to follow your heart and remain true to yourself. Ruth hugged him tightly. I'm so grateful you're always here for me. And I'm grateful to have such a wonderful granddaughter. Ruth was able to relax only on the second day of the honeymoon. Her husband lay beside her on a neighbouring sunbed, smiling at her. Husband, what a strange word, thought Ruth as she admired her ring. And how handsome Matt looks. I must take a picture of him. Ruth managed to restore her friendship with Connor a year after her marriage. Matt was away on a movie shoot for 3 months. Ruth busied herself with work, walks and books. On one of her visits to her mother's house, she ran into Gail there, who had remained as radiant, cheerful and kind all these years. How's Connor? Ruth asked casually. I haven't seen him in a while. Oh, Gail replied. He's due here in half an hour. Why don't you join us? Ruth looked embarrassed. No, that's not necessary. You two should have some time together. Gail smiled warmly but said nothing. The three of them chatted about other things until Gail made a request. Ruth, please bring the pie I baked this morning. It should have cooled down before now. I want Sarah to taste it. Oh, Sarah chimed in. Yes, Ruth, please bring it. What pie? Ruth asked, puzzled. It's on the kitchen table, Gail explained. Here are the keys. Ruth was surprised at such a request and completely forgot about Connor's imminent arrival. She was searching all over the kitchen for a missing pie when she heard the sound of the door opening and realised what was happening. Gail's a sly one, and Mum's a good actress. Mum, I'm here, she heard Connor announce. Ruth stepped into the corridor. Hi, she greeted him. He clearly hadn't expected to see her. Hi, Connor replied, sounding disgruntled. Ruth noticed that her friend had changed. He seemed more mature, his facial features sharper. Connor had also lost a significant amount of weight and grown a small beard. Ruth smiled at him and suddenly realised she had missed her friend. She quickly stepped forward and hugged him tightly, not giving him a chance to break free or resist. Connor protested at first, then sighed and returned her hug. What are you doing, Ruth? He asked in surprise. I've missed you badly, she answered honestly. Me too, Connor admitted. They stood there for a full minute. How did you end up here? I'm visiting my mum, and your mum is at As. She asked me to bring a pie, but I still can't find it. I started to suspect something. Connor smiled. Mum's always like that, only interfering when things get extreme. This is precisely the right time. I was beginning to worry that our friendship was on the line. Me too. Why don't we make tea? Sit down and talk. Our mothers aren't expecting us, right? Agreed. Life began to improve. Ruth became a renowned photographer. She no longer had to shoot things she didn't enjoy. She was finally choosing on her own. Her husband was also thriving. He was starring in 2 popular TV series and advertising watches, cologne and a dating app. Ruth had reservations about the latter. "I don't want to seem jealous," she said to her husband, "but isn't it strange for a married man to advertise a dating app?" Matt laughed and kissed his wife on the cheek. "Sunshine, I'm an actor. Everything I portray is just an image." Despite the logic in her husband's words, she wasn't comfortable with the idea. In general, she found it increasingly difficult to accept that her husband was constantly playing a role. The more they lived together, the more it seemed to Ruth that Matt was more of an image than a living person. It was as if he weren't real most of the time. Even after set, Matt continued to portray the charismatic, captivating man he usually played at work. He could flirt with women and smile at them, and Ruth could see their eyes light up. This made her angry. As time passed, their relationship began to cool off. Ruth knew that passion didn't last forever, but she was waiting for it to evolve into something calmer and more tender. It didn't. "Maybe you two don't love each other anymore," her younger sister suggested when Ruth shared her concerns. She sighed. "I hope that's not the case. I keep thinking something will change, or an event will reignite our spark." Leela suggested, "Maybe you should surprise him." "Surprise?" Ruth was puzzled. "Yes, they say it's good for couples to do something unexpected to rejuvenate their relationship." "I'll think about it," said Ruth. She pondered for a while, even consulting Connor. "Can I come over?" she asked, calling her friend. He seemed less enthusiastic than usual, but replied, "Sure, if it's urgent, but I'm not alone. I'm with Maisie." "Is that your new girlfriend?" "Yes, but this time it's different. You'll see." When Ruth arrived, Maisie herself opened the door. She was petite, wore glasses and had big blue eyes. She smiled warmly at Ruth and gave her a hug. "Hi, it's nice to finally meet you." "I'm glad too," Ruth replied, her chest tightening. The girl didn't match the conventional standards of beauty compared to Connor's previous girlfriends, but her sincerity and genuineness made Ruth realize Connor was serious this time. "Hi." Connor emerged into the corridor. "You wanted to talk? Let's go to the kitchen." "You both go into the living room," Maisie suggested, "and I'll bring some tea and freshly baked cream scones." Connor gently wrapped his arm around her waist, kissing her cheek. "Thank you, darling." For some reason, Ruth felt a pang in her heart. She quickly moved into the living room. After only an hour at Connor's, she had to leave. Seeing Maisie made her lose all thoughts. Connor didn't seem to understand why she wanted to meet so urgently. On her way home, Ruth couldn't pinpoint her feelings. Why couldn't she be happy for her best friend's happiness? "I've thought of a surprise for him," Ruth told her sister over the phone while packing. "I'm going to visit him. We haven't seen each other for a month." "Cool. You're going directly to the set?" "No, Matt wouldn't understand that. I'm going to visit him at the hotel." "Wow. Good luck, sister." "Thank you, Leela." Ruth was sure Matt would love it because he loved brightness, spontaneity, boldness, and experimentation. She had thought of everything. She rented a room in the same hotel where Matt was staying and found out when the actors would return from filming. She changed into a maid's costume, which was quite decent by her standards. It was a short black dress with a puffy skirt, a lace apron. Ruth was nervous. Her room was on the other end of the floor. It was a brave task to walk the entire corridor dressed like that. After gathering her courage, she thought of Matt's reaction and decided to go. She was lucky to meet no one in the corridor. By the time she reached the room, her legs had stopped trembling. Ruth knocked on the door and tried to change her voice. "Cleaning." "Who does cleaning at this hour?" she thought. Well, at least he'll open the door out of curiosity. Her expectations were met. The door opened, revealing a beautiful young girl with wet hair, wearing only a towel. Ruth was taken aback. "Oh, I probably have the wrong room," Ruth started, but was interrupted by Matt's voice from inside. "Sunshine, who's there?" "A maid," the girl shouted back. "Ask her to come back later." Sunshine turned to Ruth, who managed to force a smile. "I'll come back later. Have a splendid evening ahead." Ruth turned around, and the door closed behind her. Ruth couldn't recall how she ended up in her room. She sat on the bed for a long time, striving to gather her thoughts. She had no memory of how she had made it home. Feeling the need to share her experience, she considered her options. Connor would have been her go-to before, but now she pictured Maisie sweet and gentle at his house, receiving affection from Connor like no other girlfriend before. For some reason, she didn't feel like approaching her mum or sister either. That left her grandfather. He hugged her tightly upon her arrival. He didn't let on that he suspected something was wrong, though he was slightly proud that Ruth had come to him for help. He didn't rush her, keeping a watchful eye on her. "The tea's ready," he announced, placing a cup before her. They drank in silence. When Ruth poured their second cup, she finally told him about her husband's cheating. Michael listened attentively, without interruption or unnecessary questions. When she finished, he asked, "What do you feel now?" "I don't know," she responded. "What should I feel?" "Anything. Bitterness, resentment, regret, relief, anger. The important thing is to put it into words." "I feel betrayed and foolish, but also, strangely enough, relieved. It's as if I've been tormented by a mystery that I couldn't solve. Now that I know what it is, I feel relieved." "Do you want to forgive him?" She shook her head vehemently. "Absolutely not." "Are you going to get a divorce?" "Yes, but I doubt that's enough." Her eyes sparkled as she forcefully sliced a piece of cake. Her grandfather smiled. "Not enough. I think I'm beginning to recognize my granddaughter." Ruth laughed. "Matt loves grand gestures. I think it's only fair that I give him one last grand gift." "Do you have an idea yet?" Michael asked. "Yes, I do." When Ruth shared her plan, her grandfather laughed. "It's a great idea, but are you sure you're ready to spend your time and energy on such a plan?" "I'm ready," she said with pure determination in her voice, "and then I can say goodbye to him once and for all." Over the next month, Connor barely saw his friend and couldn't comprehend her sudden change. One instance, she seemed eager to share something with him. The next, she abruptly withdrew. He couldn't think of anything he had said or done to offend her, nor could he imagine Maisie saying anything to upset Ruth. Maisie was the first girl in years who had stirred warm feelings in him. She was good, kind, and sensitive. She loved and cared for him deeply. He wondered if over time he could reciprocate her feelings as strongly. After all, he couldn't forever harbour feelings for Ruth, could he? He always hoped that she would see him as more than a friend, but that never happened. He tried to forget her, but it proved futile. When he met other girls, he always quickly realised that he didn't feel anything for them. When Ruth married, any glimmer of hope he clung onto was extinguished. He disliked her husband, Matt, who seemed deceitful. He was handsome and brilliant, but Connor saw him as a scoundrel. He wondered how Ruth, usually so perceptive, could look at Matt with such adoration. But if she was happy, he decided he wouldn't interfere. Meeting Maisie eased his pain a little, giving him a reason to engage with life again. He hadn't forgotten Ruth. He never could. But Maisie offered him warmth, care and support. And now that he'd finally come to terms with it, Ruth reappeared, stirring his life, only to disappear again. For an entire month, she didn't respond to any of his calls or texts. "Connor, I'm fine, don't worry," she reassured him. "Why don't you tell me what's happening? I'm worried," he asked. "Later," Ruth replied. "You'll see for yourself." This vague explanation left Connor dissatisfied, pacing around his house trying to figure out what was going on. He noticed Maisie's concerned gaze. He felt like he didn't deserve her. Although he hadn't mentioned Ruth to Maisie, she seemed to understand. At the end of the month, a message from Ruth caught him off guard. "Hi, I invite you and Maisie to come to my first solo exhibition. It's this Saturday at 3 p.m. "Interesting," Connor muttered. When Ruth first conceived her solo exhibition, she couldn't have foreseen the personal nature of the theme. She had been mulling over different ideas for years, from abandoned parks to the city's oldest buildings to random passers-by. She never expected to choose a theme so close to her heart. Her good friend Dagny, an experienced organizer of successful exhibitions, was instrumental in helping her. "I'm sure it will be a furore," Dagny declared when she saw the pictures. Ruth grinned. "That's what I'm counting on." Her friend coughed awkwardly. "But are you sure you're ready for it? After the opening there's no turning back, I warn you." Ruth pressed her lips together tightly. "I'm sure. That's precisely how I want to end things." Dagny snorted suddenly. "Okay, in a way I can understand you. I think many of our viewers will relate to this topic too." "Yes, unfortunately." "Is anyone coming to support you?" Ruth nodded. "Yes. My mum, my younger sister and her boyfriend, my grandfather, and my best friend and his girlfriend." Ruth's voice trembled at the last words. "That's great. Will your husband be alone?" Ruth smiled. "No, he'll have almost the whole film crew with him. I had to persuade him, but it's worth it." "Work colleagues, then," Dagny said thoughtfully. "Yes, I see your point." Matt had just returned from a film shoot. The exhibition was due to start in a few hours. He was surprised when his wife told him about such an event. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "I was preparing a surprise," replied Ruth. "You like surprises, don't you?" "I love surprises, but I think I'm going to be tired." Her husband sighed. "Don't worry. I need your support just for the opening. And bring the whole film crew with you. There'll be wine and snacks." Matt laughed. "I don't know if they'll want to." "But you persuade them," his wife asked sweetly. "You always say that such events are useful. And by the way, there are many personal pictures in this exhibition," she added quietly. "Wow! You mean it's going to be about me?" Matt asked in an excited voice. He laughed. "Then I'll definitely bring everyone I can." "Okay, dear." Matt did not have an opportunity to meet his wife before the exhibition started. When he got home, Ruth wasn't there. He quickly jumped into the shower, shaved and put on his best suit. I wonder what Ruth's up to. Surely something cute and unique. She's very talented. There's no denying that. In general, Ruth is a lovely woman. It's just a pity that we sometimes don't agree on some things. He sighed. I should also ask Wendy not to hang on me in front of my wife. Matt went into the hall and saw the title of the exhibition. Love Story. The first photograph hung there. Ruth took it after the first night they spent together. He's hugging her from behind, and she's taking a picture of them in the mirror. "Nice shot," he heard Wendy's voice from behind him. "It even looks like you love her here." Matt looked around. Fortunately, there was nobody standing close to them, and there was no one to hear. "I did then," Matt replied, "and who knows, maybe I still love her." Wendy grinned, lightly running her fingers along his arm. "But all these months during filming, every night in your hotel room, you've been saying the opposite," she purred. He smiled. "Don't play with my heart like that, sweetheart. You know I won't surrender you to her," she added and clawed at his wrist. Matt looked around anxiously. People were arriving. If Wendy continued to behave this way, they would certainly be suspected. "You remember our agreement, don't you?" he said. "Let's act like just colleagues." "And what if I don't?" The girl pouted. "Maybe I'm tired of hiding. Maybe I want your wife to know everything." Her words sent a chill down Matt's spine. He did not want to lose his wife. "I love Ruth. All these actresses, models, casual admirers over the years are empty. Even Wendy. Only Ruth interests me. Only she is worthy of being my wife," he thought. Suddenly, he caught someone else's gaze. It was Connor. "Let's go look at the other pictures," Matt said to Wendy. She smiled, nodded cordially, and walked beside him. Each new photo revealed their love story with Ruth. These were pictures from their first photo shoot. How hard he had tried. "You look great here," Wendy said thoughtfully. "No other photographer could capture your beauty like this. Your wife is talented. I can't deny that." The man nodded. There weren't many pictures of him with Ruth, mostly his portraits and random shots. He hadn't noticed her taking his pictures so often. With peripheral vision, Matt saw the guests' reactions to the photos. They recognized him. This exhibition was a tribute to him, a declaration of love from his talented wife. Then there were photos from their honeymoon. Then came shots of everyday family life. Ruth captured him rehearsing monologues, choosing shirts for auditions, brushing his teeth. Every photo expressed the photographer's love for the subject. Matt sensed Wendy's discomfort viewing the pictures. "It's okay. Let her see how much he is loved. Even if she leaves him, it won't matter. The main thing is, she mustn't tell his wife anything," Matt thought. But in the next room, the mood changed. He looked different in the photos. Cold, distant, frowning. Perhaps that's how he had been with her lately. "It's okay. He'll make it right. Ruth loves him so much. He'll definitely take a holiday and spend time with her. She deserves it. Their relationship will be as joyous and vibrant as it was on their honeymoon." Then he entered the last hall. It was the most populated. He and Wendy had to squeeze through the visitors to reach the photos. Matt froze. It was him and Wendy in the pictures. He turned his head, and his partner looked at him fearfully. "Everyone is looking at us," she whispered. He couldn't comprehend when Ruth had managed to film this. The events captured in their photographs had transpired recently, not more than a month ago. "Is that your wife?" Wendy suddenly asked. "I saw her in the hotel." Matt looked up. In the center picture was Ruth, alone, taking a mirror selfie. It was similar to a picture at the beginning of the exhibition, but this time only Ruth was in the frame, calm and cold. She had discovered his infidelity. "I must find my wife and talk to her," he said, scanning the room. Ruth's mother and sister were nearby, along with her grandfather. He spotted Connor, and unexpectedly, the redhead did not look at him with contempt or triumph, but pity. "Thinks he's beaten me? No way." Finally, he noticed his wife. "Ruth, what is this?" His wife looked at him calmly. He saw no anger, hatred, or signs of recent tears, only indifference. "Didn't you read the title?" she asked. "It's written at the entrance." "A love story," Matt mumbled. Ruth nodded. "And ours has ended today." Connor couldn't sleep until morning. Back at home, Connor took a quick shower and pretended to sleep. Maisie left him alone, turned off the light, and settled on her own side of the bed. Ruth knows everything now. She's finally realized what kind of man her husband is. They will surely part their ways. But why should I care? Of course, as a friend, I'll always support her. But is that the point? And besides, how could he think of Ruth now, with Maisie beside him? Sweet, kind, gentle, loving Maisie. She loves me as much as I love Ruth. I can't betray her. He eventually fell asleep and woke up at lunchtime, his head throbbing. Maisie was gone. His attention was drawn to the half-open cupboard door. He looked inside and rushed into the kitchen. Maisie was there, writing on a large piece of paper. "Maisie?" Connor asked, surprised. "What's going on?" She looked up and smiled softly. "I'm leaving you." "But why? What happened?" She smiled again. "I know you've been in love with your best friend for years." Connor shook his head desperately. "Maisie, I swear I've never cheated on you." "I know. It's not that. I'm just tired of being second best." She raised her hand to stop him speaking. "It's not your fault. It was clear to me from the beginning. Only someone who loves unrequitedly can understand someone else who feels the same. But you chose to be with me, and that made me happy. I thought I could wait for you as long as it takes. I thought my love could reach your heart." "It did." "Don't, Connor. I know that you treat me well, that you're ready to make me your wife and live with me all your life. You're a good man, I know. But you don't look at me the way you look at her, and I don't want to spend my only life constantly thinking about it. It'll be hard for me at first, but I'm sure I'll meet someone who will love me just as much." Connor sighed. "You're wonderful." She smiled. "Thank you. Tell her how you feel." Maisie stood up, hugged him tightly, then kissed him on the cheek. She picked up her suitcase from the corridor and carefully closed the door behind her. Connor slowly sank into a chair. A few days later, he went to visit his mother, carrying a lot on his mind. As a child, it seemed to him that his mother knew the answers to everything, so he was surprised that, as an adult, she always gave him a choice, never persuaded or insisted, and accepted any decision he made. "I'm so tired and confused, Mum," Connor said. "I know, sunshine, I know," she said soothingly. They sat in the kitchen of the flat they had moved into years ago. "Get some sleep, son," Gail suddenly said. "When you wake up, you'll know what to do next." Connor yawned, his eyes heavy from lack of sleep. His mother walked him to his childhood room, and he went to bed. He dreamt of a spring day when he and Ruth, both around 12 years old, were launching paper boats on puddles. Connor looked at her and thought she was the most beautiful girl in the world. "Connor," Ruth asked him, "will our ship sink again?" Connor shook his head confidently. "No, Ruth, it won't sink." They carefully placed the boat into the cold spring water. The boat rocked slightly but stayed afloat. Connor smiled. "Connor! Connor!" Someone shook him by the shoulders. Connor opened his eyes and saw Ruth's smiling face above him. "You sleep just like you did when you were a child," she said to him, "with your hand under your head." "Well, yes," he said confusedly, wiping his eyes. "What are you doing here?" She shrugged her shoulders oddly. "Seems like we have something to talk about." His heart thumped. "I hope we want to talk about the same thing." Ruth nodded and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "That's what I'm about to find out." She suddenly leaned in and kissed him. Connor forgot how to breathe, then gently put his arms around her and drew her closer. Yes, definitely, they wanted to talk about the same thing.